Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. The world around you is busy. It is filled with light and sound and the demands of the present moment. But here, in this space, we will let all of that gently fall away. Find a position that feels deeply comfortable. Allow your shoulders to soften, your jaw to relax. Feel the support of the surface beneath you, and give your weight over to it completely. Let your breathing find its own slow, natural rhythm, an easy tide in and out. Tonight, our journey will take us far from the familiar. We are setting aside the well-trodden paths of history to travel to a different time, a different continent, a different understanding of the world itself. We are journeying back 500 years, to the high valley of Mexico, to a city that shimmered like a mirage, a metropolis built on water, the great Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. This was a civilization of profound dualities. It was a world of breathtaking artistry, of intricate poetry, of engineering that rivaled any on Earth. They charted the stars with stunning accuracy, built towering pyramids that served as stairways to the heavens, and cultivated miraculous floating gardens that fed a city larger than any in Europe at the time. Yet, this incredible achievement was built upon a foundation of rigid social control, relentless warfare, and a demanding cosmology that saw human existence as a small part of a violent, cosmic struggle. Our exploration tonight will not be one of sensationalism or drama. Instead, we will seek a quiet understanding. We will walk the stone-paved causeways and paddle the canals, listen to the murmur of the marketplace, and feel the rhythm of a life both alien and deeply human. We will do this slowly, piece by piece, allowing the details to form a rich and complex picture. So let your mind drift. Let the sounds and images wash over you without effort. Our journey begins now. We start, as we so often do, not in the palaces of the emperor or the sanctums of the priests, but with the ordinary people, the millions of hands that held the empire up. We begin with the life of a single farmer, on a single day, in the heart of this city on the lake. The grueling grind. Daily life of a Makewali. Imagine your consciousness settling, not in your own time, but here. The year is 1500. The place is Tenochtitlan. You are a Machifuali, a commoner. This is not a title of disgrace, it is the name for the vast majority of people, the sinew and muscle of the empire. Your identity is rooted in your family, and in your Kalpuli, a district or neighborhood that is more than a geographic location. It is a community, a clan, a small world unto itself. Your awareness begins in darkness. There is no window in your small one-room home, only a single doorway covered by a woven reed mat. The darkness is absolute. A thick, velvety black. The air is cool, carrying the familiar smells of your life, the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke from yesterday's fire, the dry dustiness of the adobe walls, the subtle sweetness of the thatched roof above, and the ever-present, underlying scent of damp earth and lake water that permeates everything in this city. You are lying on a petlattle, a mat of woven reeds laid directly on the packed earth floor. It is firm, unyielding, but your body is accustomed to it. Beside you, the slow, rhythmic breathing of your family fills the small space. Your spouse, your children, all sharing this single room. This proximity is not a burden. It is the simple, unquestioned reality of your existence. What awakens you is not a sound, but a subtle shift. Perhaps it is a change in the air pressure, or the first, almost imperceptible lessening of the profound darkness that signals the approach of dawn. Or perhaps it is the sound that is almost not a sound. The distant, deep, resonant thrum of the great snakeskin drum, the huetl, from the summit of the Templo Mayor in the sacred heart of the city. It is a pulse you have felt every day of your life, a low-frequency vibration that you feel more in your bones than you hear with your ears. It is the heartbeat of the empire, a constant reminder of the gods and the order they command. You rise silently, careful not to disturb your sleeping family. You are barefoot, and the floor is cool against your soles. You push aside the mat covering the doorway, and step outside. The world is a study in shades of gray and black. The stars are brilliant in the high-altitude air, a dense spray of diamonds across the sky. The moon, if it is out, casts a soft milky light on the calm waters of the canals that serve as your streets. Across the water, the dark shapes of your neighbors' houses are silent. In the distance, rising above the low profile of the city, are the colossal geometric silhouettes of the pyramids in the sacred precinct, man-made mountains connecting your world to the realm of the gods. And far beyond them, forming the eastern rim of your world, are the two immense volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, their snow-capped peaks, glowing faintly in the starlight. They are deities, powerful and ancient, and their presence is a source of both awe and comfort. Your first task is to bring life back to the hearth. The hearth is the spiritual and physical center of your home, sacred to the old god of fire, Quetzalcoatl. The embers from last night have died, leaving a bed of cool grey ash. You take your fire drill, a simple but effective tool consisting of a pointed hardwood stick and a small notched piece of softer wood. Placing the point in the notch, you begin to spin the stick rapidly between your palms. It is a skill learned in childhood, a rhythmic, repetitive motion that requires patience and practice. For long moments there is only the sound of wood rubbing against wood. Then, a thin wisp of smoke appears, carrying a sharp, acrid smell. You lean in, blowing gently, coaxing the tiny, glowing ember that has formed. You transfer this fragile spark to a prepared bundle of dry grass or cotton fluff, which bursts into a small, bright flame. Carefully you feed it small twigs, then larger pieces of wood, until the fire is stable, casting a warm, flickering light that pushes back the shadows in your small home. With the fire lit, the woman of the house begins the first and most fundamental task of the day, preparing the maize. Maize, or tla oli, is not merely food. It is a divine gift, the substance from which the gods formed humanity. To waste it is a sin. The process begins with nixtamalization, a crucial step that unlocks the full nutritional potential of the corn. The dried kernels, harvested months ago, have been soaking overnight in a clay pot filled with water and alkaline wood ash. This process softens the tough outer hull of the corn, but more importantly, it chemically transforms it, releasing essential amino acids and niacin. Without this ancient chemical knowledge, a society dependent on maize would suffer from severe malnutrition. She drains the pot and rinses the swollen kernels, then carries them to the metate, a three-legged grinding stone made from volcanic rock, tilted at a slight angle. Using a heavy cylindrical stone pestle called a mano, she begins to grind the corn. It is laborious work. She kneels before the stone, using the weight of her upper body to press the mano down, rolling and crushing the kernels into a soft, wet dough called masa. The sound fills the house, a rhythmic, scraping, gritty noise that is the morning music of every household in the empire. It is a sound of sustenance, of life. From this masa, the morning meal is made. Some of it will be flattened into thin discs, and cooked later on a hot clay griddle, the comal, to make tortillas. But for now, a portion is mixed with water in a pot, and set by the fire to warm. This is atole, a simple, life-sustaining porridge. It is a bland but deeply comforting food, the fuel that will power your morning's labor. You and your family drink it from small clay bowls, savoring its warmth in the cool pre-dawn air. As the sky begins to turn from gray to a soft, pearlescent pink, you prepare for your own work. You wear a simple loincloth, or maxlatl, made of coarse maguey fiber, and if the morning is particularly cold, a rough cloak, or tilmatli, knotted over one shoulder. Your clothing is functional, durable, and marks you clearly as a commoner. You step out of your home and into your akali, a small dugout canoe, hollowed from the trunk of a single tree. It is narrow and slightly wobbly, but you move with an innate, lifelong sense of balance. With a long wooden pole, you push off from the small earthen dock in front of your house and glide into the silent waters of the canal. Your journey to work is a commute by water. The canals of Tenochtitlan are its arteries, a vast network that crisscrosses the entire city. In the early morning light, the water is like dark glass, reflecting the sky. You pass other canoes, your neighbors also heading out to their gardens. A quiet nod, a soft-spoken greeting in Nahuatl is all that is exchanged. The city is waking up around you. The sound of slapping laundry comes from a nearby dock. A fisherman is already out on the broader waterway, casting his fine net. The air carries the combined smells of 1,000 households, the ever-present wood smoke, the cooking maize, the flowers that grow in abundance on every home's rooftop and porch. Your destination is your family's plot, your Chinampa. This is the agricultural marvel that sustains Tenochtitlan. From a distance it looks as though the city is surrounded by a vast green checkerboard of floating fields, but they do not truly float. A Chinampa is a masterpiece of land reclamation. a stationary island you and your ancestors built in the shallow bed of Lake Texcoco. First, your grandfather would have driven long stakes of willow wood deep into the lake bed, forming a rectangular enclosure. These stakes, from the hardy ahuexotl tree, would eventually take root, their living root systems forming a strong, permanent fence. Within this enclosure, you and your family would have layered mud, dredged from the canal floor with decaying aquatic vegetation, building it up layer by layer until it rose above the water level. The result is a plot of land that is constantly irrigated from below and fantastically fertile from the rich organic matter of the lake bed. You guide your canoe into a narrow channel alongside your garden and step out, your bare feet sinking slightly into the cool, damp, almost spongy earth. The chinampa is a riot of managed life. The tallest plants are the maize stalks, standing in neat rows. They are the backbone of the garden, both physically and nutritionally. Climbing these stalks are bean vines, their tendrils wrapping around the sturdy corn for support. At the base, sprawling across the ground, are broad-leafed squash plants. This is the sacred trinity of Mesoamerican agriculture, the Three Sisters, a symbiotic system perfected over thousands of years. The maize provides the structure, the beans fix nitrogen in the soil to fertilize their companions, and the squash provides a living mulch, its large leaves shading the soil, keeping it cool and moist, and suppressing the growth of weeds. Your first task of the day is weeding. You move slowly along the rows, your eyes scanning for any intrusive plants. Your primary tool is the koa, a long fire-hardened wooden pole, with a flattened blade-like tip. It is a digging stick, a hoe, a weeder, and a shovel, all in one. With deft movements, you uproot unwanted growth and press it into the mud, where it will decay and add to the soil's fertility. Nothing is wasted. Next, you check the other crops. There are rows of chili peppers. They're small, glossy fruits, in shades of green and red. There are tomato plants, not the large round variety known today, but smaller zitomaten and amaranth, a grain with a nutty flavor whose leaves are also eaten as a green. And there are the flowers. Flowers are not a luxury here, they are a crop, an essential part of religious and social life. You cultivate rows of Quetzalcoatl, the bright orange and yellow marigolds whose pungent scent is believed to guide the spirits of the dead, making them vital for rituals. There are dahlias too, in a profusion of colors. The work is methodical, physical, and requires immense knowledge. You know the exact right time to plant by observing the stars and the seasons. You know which pests to look for and which plants can be grown near each other to repel them. You know how to read the color of a leaf to tell if a plant needs more nutrients. This is a science passed down not in books, but through generations of observation and practice. Throughout the morning you work under the rising sun, the repetitive motions of bending, pulling, and digging creating a familiar ache in your back and shoulders. It is a pain you have known your whole life. As midday approaches, the sun is high and hot. You pause your work, finding shade under one of the willow trees that anchor the corner of your chinampa. Your midday meal is simple, brought from home in a small cloth, a few cold tortillas, and perhaps a piece of fruit. As you eat, you watch the life of the city move around you. Large transport canoes move down the main canals, laden with goods for the great market at Tlatelolco. You see a canoe belonging to a noble, distinguished by its painted decorations and the fine cotton clothing of its occupants. They exist in a different world, a world you serve but will never enter. Your labor, your food, your very existence is bound by a system of obligation. The land you work does not belong to you personally. It is held by your kalpulai, and the kalpuli in turn owes a massive portion of its production to the state. The tribute collector is a familiar figure, an official who assesses your garden and dictates the share you owe. It might be a certain number of woven blankets of maguey fiber, a portion of your maize harvest, or a quota of your chili peppers. This tribute, the tequitl, is the economic engine of the empire. It feeds the priests who commune with the gods, the bureaucrats who manage the state, and the warriors who expand its borders. To fail to meet your tribute quota is a grave offense, bringing shame upon your family and risking punishment. This obligation is a constant low-level anxiety, a shadow that hangs even over the most productive harvest. The afternoon may bring a different kind of labor. For several weeks out of the year, All able-bodied men are conscripted for the quotquittal or state labor tax. Today might be one of those days. After tending to your garden, you would paddle, not home, but to a designated meeting point for your kalpuli. There, an overseer would assign you to a work gang. Perhaps the task is to repair a section of the Great Causeway to Tlacopan. You would join hundreds of other men, a human conveyor belt, carrying heavy stones and baskets of rubble to fill a breach. The work is grueling and anonymous. You are a tiny part of a colossal project, your individual effort subsumed into the whole. You work to the rhythm of chants and shouted orders, your muscles screaming in protest. Or perhaps you are sent to the forests on the mainland to chop wood for the thousands of fires in the city, or to the quarries to help cut the stone blocks destined for a new temple. This labor is framed as a sacred duty, an act of service to the Tlatoani, the emperor, and through him to the gods. There is a certain pride in it, in seeing a great temple rise, knowing your sweat is mixed in its mortar. But it is also a stark reminder of your position. You are a resource of the state, as much as the timber from the forests, or the stone from the mountains. Your time and your energy are not entirely your own. This sense of being a small part of a vast, divine, and often terrifying machine is inescapable. From your Chinampa, you can always see the twin pyramids of the Templo Mayor, the center of your universe. One is dedicated to Twilok, the god of rain and water, who gives you life with one hand, and can take it away with floods and drought with the other. The other, painted a stark red, belongs to Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of the sun and of war, the patron deity of your people, the Mexica. It is on the summit of his temple that the ultimate price is paid. You have seen the processions. You have seen the captive warriors, taken in the flower wars, painted and adorned with paper banners, being led up the impossibly steep stairs. You have heard the cheers of the crowd and the deep, booming pulse of the drums. You understand, as everyone does, that this is necessary. You are taught that the sun will not rise, the rains will not come, the cosmos will fall into chaos, if the gods are not fed with the precious water, the sacred energy of human life. It is a worldview that justifies the empire's perpetual state of war, and sanctifies the ultimate act of violence. While the victims are almost always foreigners and captives, the ritual is a display of power that reinforces the state's control over life and death itself. It is a terrifying spectacle that instills a deep-seated fear and obedience, a reminder that the needs of the gods, as interpreted by the priests and the emperor, supersede all else. As the sun begins its descent, casting long shadows across the lake, your workday comes to an end. Whether from the Chinampa or a state labor project, you paddle your canoe home through the golden light of late afternoon. Your body is heavy with fatigue. You return to your small house to find the evening meal prepared. Your wife has been to the local market, perhaps trading a few of your surplus vegetables for a handful of lake shrimp, or some edible insects, like grasshoppers, toasted on the comal. The family gathers around the hearth as the last light fades from the sky. The tortillas are warm, the simple bean stew is savory. This meal, at the end of a long day of toil, is a moment of profound comfort and connection. After the meal, as darkness envelops the city once more, the family might share stories. A grandfather might recount the legends of the ancestors, the great migration from the mythical homeland of Aztlan, or the founding of Tenochtitlan. These stories are your history, your identity. They explain your world and your place in it. There is no other light but the soft glow of the fire. The sounds of the city change. The busy noise of the day is replaced by the chirping of crickets, the croaking of frogs in the canals, and the occasional barking of a dog. Soon, it is time for rest. You lie down again on your reed mat, your muscles aching, your mind filled with the simple calculus of survival, the state of the crops, the coming weather, the tribute you owe. You are exhausted, but it is the exhaustion of a life of purpose, however difficult. You are a farmer, a father, a subject of the most powerful empire your world has ever known. You are a Makayawali of Tenochtitlan. You close your eyes, and in the deep quiet of the night, you can still feel it. That low, steady, unending pulse from the heart of the city. The drumbeat of the gods, waiting for the sun to rise again. A life of legend. The tragic story of Moctezuma, too, from the quiet canals and the fertile earth of the Chinampas. our attention now travels inward and upward. We move past the bustling marketplaces and the stone-faced houses of the common people, through the grand avenues, and toward the very heart of the city's power. We are going to the great palace complex, the administrative and ceremonial center of the empire, to explore the life of the man who sat at its apex. The Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma the Younger. To understand the tragedy of his reign is to understand the man himself, and the world that forged him long before he ever wore the turquoise diadem of supreme authority. Born around the year 1466, he was not a man defined by the battlefield, unlike his aggressive and expansionist predecessors. His nature was of a different quality. He was at his core a scholar, a priest, a man of deep and profound piety, whose life was governed by the intricate and unyielding cycles of the sacred calendars. His education took place not in a warrior's school, but in the Karmakak, the elite institution reserved for the sons of the nobility. Here life was one of extreme austerity and rigorous discipline, designed to strip away arrogance and instill a deep and abiding reverence for the gods. Imagine a young Moctezuma, rising before dawn to take part in frigid ritual baths, learning to endure pain and hunger through long fasts and acts of self-sacrifice. His days were not filled with military drills, but with the complex arts of governance and religion, which, in the Aztec worldview, were inextricably linked. He would have spent endless hours committing to memory the vast oral histories of his people, the epic migrations, the genealogies of kings. He learned the language of poetry and rhetoric, the elegant and highly formal version of the Nahuatl language required for diplomacy and prayer. He studied the sky, learning to read the movements of the stars and planets, to understand their divine significance, and to calculate their paths with breathtaking precision. He delved into the esoteric knowledge of the priesthood, mastering the intricate workings of the two Aztec calendars, the 365-day solar calendar that governed the agricultural seasons, and the 260-day sacred calendar, the Tonalpoiawali, an interlocking cycle of days and deities that determined the fate of every single hour of every single day. For Moctezuma, the universe was not a random or chaotic place. It was a vast, complex, and divinely ordered machine. His life's purpose, as he saw it, was to understand its mechanisms, and to ensure, through correct and timely ritual, that it did not fall out of balance. This education forged a ruler who was contemplative, intellectual, and deeply conservative, a man who saw radical change not as an opportunity, but as a terrifying disruption to the cosmic order. In the year 1502, the Huey Tlatoani Ahuitzotl, Moctezuma's uncle and a famously ruthless military commander, died. The empire was at its zenith, a vast domain stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. The time had come to choose a successor. The position of great speaker was not strictly hereditary. A council of the highest-ranking nobles, the most powerful priests, and the wisest electors convened to select the new ruler from the eligible members of the royal family. They sought a man who possessed the necessary tonal or spiritual force to lead. Their choice fell upon Moctezuma. Perhaps they saw in his scholarly piety a necessary counterbalance to the brutal expansionism of the previous reign. Perhaps they believed the empire, now vast and wealthy, needed a skilled administrator more than another great warrior. Whatever their reasoning, the choice was made. Moctezuma's reaction, according to the codices, was one of profound humility. He was said to have hidden when the electors came to inform him, feeling unworthy of such a monumental responsibility. His coronation was not a celebration of personal glory, but a solemn, awesome transformation. It was a series of rituals designed to turn a mortal man into a semi-divine vessel, the living intermediary between the 80,000 people of his city, the millions in his empire, and the pantheon of powerful and demanding gods. The ceremony began with a long period of fasting and prayer in the temple. He would have performed acts of ritual bloodletting, piercing his own tongue and ears with sharpened bones or maguey thorns, offering his own precious life force to the deities he was now bound to serve. Finally, he was led before the great idols in the Templo Mayor, anointed, and dressed in the sacred vestments of his office. He was draped in cloaks of the most intricate and brilliantly colored featherwork, an art form more precious than gold to the Aztecs. And upon his head was placed the Xixihuitzoli, the turquoise diadem, a pointed crown of shimmering blue-green stone that was the ultimate symbol of imperial power. At that moment, Moctezuma the man ceased to be. He became the Huey Tlatoani, the one whose voice was the voice of the empire, the one whose personal well-being was now directly tied to the health of the cosmos itself. His new home was the palace of his father, Axayacatl, a vast and sprawling complex near the sacred precinct. It was a city within a city, a labyrinth of stone buildings, open courtyards and lush gardens. Its scale was almost unimaginable. There were vast council chambers where the business of the empire was conducted, audience halls where tribute was received, and private apartments for the emperor and his extensive family. But there was so much more. There was a great aviary, filled with thousands of birds of every imaginable color, their songs providing a constant living soundtrack to palace life. There was a zoological garden, housing jaguars, pumas, eagles, and serpents from every corner of the empire. There were workshops for the most skilled artisans, the featherworkers, the goldsmiths, the mosaic artists, who worked exclusively for the state. An army of servants, officials, priests, and guards lived and worked within its walls. The entire complex was a microcosm of the empire, a display of the Tlatoani's absolute command over the natural and human worlds. Life within this magnificent setting was one of profound isolation. The reverence afforded to Moctezuma was so extreme that it bordered on the inhuman. He was considered too sacred for ordinary mortals to look upon. When he moved through his palace, his attendants would hold up screens of cloth to shield him from view. When he had to be addressed, even by the highest-ranking nobles, they had to enter his presence barefoot, their eyes fixed on the floor, speaking in a low whisper. No one was permitted to turn their back on him. His daily routine was a study in ritual and repetition. He would wake before dawn, be bathed by his attendants, and dressed in fresh cotton clothes of immaculate quality. He never wore the same garment twice. At the end of the day, his clothes were either given as gifts to favored nobles, or stored in the royal armory. His meals were a spectacle of their own. Each day, his chefs prepared hundreds of different dishes for his consideration, an offering that showcased the immense diversity of the tribute flowing into the capital. There were dozens of preparations of turkey, venison, wild boar and game birds. There were fish from the coast, packed in ice and rushed to the capital by relay runners. There were tamales, tortillas and stews flavored with a vast array of chilies, herbs and spices. Moctezuma would sit alone, separated by a carved wooden screen, as 4 elderly and high-ranking noblemen stood by to advise him. He would point to the dishes he desired, and they would be served to him on fine Cholula pottery, brought by silent, barefoot women. His most famous indulgence was zocolatl, a drink made from precious cacao beans, ground and mixed with water, chili and other spices, then whipped into a thick, bitter froth. It was a powerful stimulant, served to him in cups of pure gold. After his meal, the work of the empire would begin. He would spend hours in his council chamber with his highest advisor, the Cihuacoatl, or woman serpent, a title held by a man who was effectively his prime minister. Together, they would listen to reports from every corner of the empire. Messengers, their cloaks knotted in specific ways to denote the urgency and origin of their message, would arrive to report on the state of the harvest in a distant province. Tribute collectors would present painted codices detailing the goods received from a newly conquered town. Judges would bring difficult legal cases for his final verdict. He made decisions on the construction of temples and aqueducts, the appointment of governors, and the logistical preparations for military campaigns. It was slow, meticulous, bureaucratic work, the quiet administration of a vast and complex state machine. But his most important duties were spiritual. Moctezuma would spend a significant portion of each day in his personal shrines, meditating, praying, and burning offerings of copal incense. His every action was governed by the sacred calendars. He consulted constantly with the high priests, the keepers of the divine knowledge, to interpret signs and portents, to ensure that every state ceremony was performed at the correct, auspicious moment. He lived in a state of constant, vigilant spiritual attention, believing that a single ritual performed incorrectly, a single omen misread, could bring disaster upon his people. This was the crushing weight of his office, the belief that the stability of the entire universe rested, in some small way, upon his shoulders. It is through this lens of deep, unshakable piety, that we must view the events that would unravel his world. Around the year 1510, nearly a decade before the arrival of the Spanish, a series of deeply disturbing omens began to occur. For a practical, modern mind, they might be dismissed as unrelated natural phenomena, but for Moctezuma and his people, they were terrifyingly coherent messages from the gods. First, a great column of fire, shaped like a pyramid, appeared in the eastern sky. It was seen every night for a year, a silent, blazing portent that filled the populace with dread. Then, the temple dedicated to the war god Huitzilopochtli, the patron of the Aztecs, spontaneously burst into flames. There was no storm, no apparent cause. Water thrown on the flames only seemed to make them burn hotter, until the stone temple was reduced to ruins. Not long after, another temple was struck by a lightning bolt, but it came from a clear sky, with no clap of thunder. The omens grew stranger. The waters of Lake Texcoco, normally calm, began to boil and foam, rising up to flood parts of the city. At night, a mournful, wailing voice was heard drifting over the streets, the sound of a woman crying for her lost children, an event that would echo down the centuries in the myth of La Llorona. Fishermen brought Moctezuma a strange ash-colored bird, like a crane, that had been caught on the lake. On its head was a polished, circular mirror. When Moctezuma, filled with trepidation, looked into the mirror, he did not see his own reflection. He saw the night sky, and then a vision of a great number of men, armed for war, riding on creatures that looked like large deer. When he showed the mirror to his soothsayers, the vision vanished. These portents plunged Moctezuma into a state of deep anxiety and spiritual crisis. He summoned his wisest priests, his magicians and his diviners, demanding an explanation, but they could offer none. Their failure to interpret these clear signs from the gods filled him with fury and fear. He felt he was flying blind, that the gods were speaking, but his people had forgotten how to listen. His anxiety was compounded by a powerful piece of his own culture's mythology, the legend of the feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl. According to the stories, Quetzalcoatl was a benevolent king and deity who had once ruled over the Toltecs. He was described as being fair-skinned and bearded. After being tricked by a rival deity, he was forced into exile, sailing away to the east across the Gulf of Mexico. But before he left, he promised he would one day return. The year he was prophesied to return was a one-reed year in the sacred calendar. The next one-reed year was 1519. It was in that very year that the first frantic reports arrived. Messengers from the coast, exhausted and terrified, brought him painted cloths, the news reports of their day. They depicted things so alien they barely had words for them. Floating mountains, moving on the water without paddles. Men with skin as pale as limestone and hair the color of the sun. Strange, savage dogs that were larger than any they had known. They described their weapons, thunder sticks, that spat fire and smoke with a deafening roar. And most terrifying of all, they described the beasts these strange men rode upon. Enormous deer, without horns, that were fast, powerful, and obedient to their riders. For Moctezuma, looking at these paintings, this was not news of foreign invaders. This was the fulfillment of a prophecy. The omens, the mirror, the legend, it was all coming to pass. The gods were returning from the east. His reaction was not one of military aggression, but of religious reverence and fear. He did not dispatch an army to annihilate the newcomers. He dispatched emissaries, priests bearing the sacred vestments of Quetzalcoatl himself. He sent them with gifts of almost inconceivable value. A solid gold disc the size of a cartwheel, representing the sun. Another of silver, representing the moon. Intricate featherwork shields, headdresses of shimmering green quetzal feathers, and masks inlaid with turquoise. His strategy was one of divine appeasement. He was acknowledging their power, paying them tribute, hoping these godlike beings would be satisfied and turn back. He could not have known that this display of immense wealth would have the precise opposite effect on the Spanish, inflaming their greed and hardening their resolve to march inland and claim it all. On November 8, 1519, after months of marching, fighting, and making alliances with the Aztecs' discontented subject peoples, Hernán Cortés and his small army stood at the entrance to Tenochtitlan. The meeting that took place on the Great Causeway was one of the most fateful moments in human history, a meeting of two worlds that had developed in complete isolation from one another. Moctezuma, the most powerful man in Mesoamerica, was carried out on a magnificent litter, shaded by a canopy of green feathers. He was barefoot, but wore golden sandals. He was adorned with jewels and the turquoise diadem of his office. Cortés, the ambitious and ruthless conquistador, sat astride his horse. Through translators, they exchanged greetings. Cortés attempted a clumsy embrace, which was blocked by the attendant nobles. Moctezuma, in a gesture of supreme hospitality and fatal miscalculation, invited the Spaniards into his city. He housed them in the palace of his father, a vast complex that could easily contain them. His reasoning remains a subject of debate. Was he trying to keep these powerful, unpredictable beings close, to study them and understand their nature? Or was he paralyzed by his own religious certainty, believing he had no choice but to welcome the returning gods into his home? For several days, a tense peace held. The Spaniards were dazzled by the city's scale and splendor. Moctezuma continued to treat them as honored, if terrifying, guests. Then, in a move of astonishing audacity, Cortés and a few of his captains went to Moctezuma's palace, and, under a flimsy pretext, placed him under arrest. They took him from his own chambers, and escorted him across the square to the palace where they were staying. It was a bloodless coup, a kidnapping at the highest possible level. And Moctezuma, inexplicably, went along with it. He calmed his enraged nobles and ordered them to stand down. From that moment on, the great speaker, the semi-divine ruler of the Aztec Empire, was a prisoner. He continued to hold court, to issue orders, to conduct the business of the empire, but always with a Spanish guard at his side. He had become a puppet. His final days were a slow, agonizing decline. His authority withered. The Aztec nobility, led by his own brother, Cuitlaca, began to see him not as a wise and pious leader, but as a coward and a traitor. The final break came during the festival of Toxcatl. With Cortés away dealing with a rival Spanish force on the coast, his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, ordered a massacre of thousands of unarmed Aztec nobles who were celebrating in the Great Temple. The city exploded in fury. The Spaniards were besieged in their palace. When Cortés returned, he convinced Moctezuma to go out onto the palace rooftop to speak to his people, to command them to lay down their arms. But the man they saw was no longer their revered Tlatoani. He was a pawn of the hated foreigners. As he began to speak, the crowd erupted in insults, and a volley of stones and arrows. The historical accounts of what happened next diverge. The Spanish sources claim he was struck in the head by a stone thrown from the crowd and died from his wounds a few days later, refusing food and medical treatment. The Aztec codices, however, tell a different story. They claim that after he had failed to pacify the crowd, the Spanish, seeing he was no longer of any use to them, killed him quietly inside the palace. However it happened, the result was the same. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the priest-king, the scholar, the man who had ruled an empire and communed with the gods, died a prisoner in his own city. His story is one of a man trapped by his own worldview, unable to comprehend or adapt to a threat that lay entirely outside his experience. He was a product of his intricate, ordered and deeply religious world, and when that world was confronted by a brutal and incomprehensible reality, it, and he, shattered completely. His death marked the end of an era, the extinguishing of a light, and the beginning of the final, violent and tragic fall of his magnificent city on the lake. Echoes of the Templo Mayor. After the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the new Spanish rulers began a process of systematic erasure. It was both a practical and a profoundly symbolic act. To build their new colonial capital, Mexico City, they needed stone. And to break the spirit of the conquered Mexica people, they needed to destroy their gods. The great pyramids of the sacred precinct, the towering centers of Aztec spiritual life, were dismantled, their stones pulled down and repurposed to build Catholic churches and colonial palaces. The Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, the literal and symbolic center of the Aztec universe, vanished. For nearly 450 years, it was thought to be lost, buried and forgotten beneath the bustling streets of one of an immense modern metropolis. Its exact location was a matter of academic debate, a ghost haunting the city's colonial heart. Then came the 21st of February 1978. Imagine the scene. The Zocalo, the great central square of Mexico City. It is a place of constant motion and noise. Cars, buses, the chatter of crowds, the calls of street vendors, the ringing bells of the massive metropolitan cathedral that dominates the northern side of the square. It is a place firmly planted in the 20th century. On this day, a crew from the city's electric light company was at work, digging a trench at the corner of Guatemala and Argentina streets, just behind the cathedral. Their work was routine, their task to lay new underground cables. Their shovels and pickaxes bit into the dense, dark earth, a mixture of soil and centuries of urban rubble. Then, one of the workers felt his shovel strike something unyielding. It was not the familiar clink of a loose stone or a buried pipe. It was a solid, massive surface. They cleared away more earth, assuming it was a large foundation stone from a colonial building. But as more of the surface was revealed, they saw that it was carved. This was no ordinary stone. Work was halted. Archaeologists from the National Institute of Anthropology and History were called to the site. As they began the slow, careful process of clearing the earth, the true nature of the discovery began to emerge. It was a single, colossal, carved stone disc. As days of painstaking work turned into weeks, the full image was revealed, and it was breathtaking. The stone was a disc of pinkish andesite, more than 3 meters, or nearly 11 feet in diameter. Carved onto its surface in deep relief was a dramatic and powerful image, the figure of a female deity, her body naked and profoundly broken. Her head, arms and legs were severed from her torso, scattered around the edge of the disc. On her cheeks were small carved bells, and her body was adorned with other divine symbols, serpents, skulls, and monster faces. The archaeologists knew immediately what they had found. This was not just a piece of sculpture. It was a sacred narrative in stone. It was a representation of the moon goddess, Coyolxauhqui, whose name means, she who is painted with bells, and this image depicted the central moment of the Aztec origin myth. The story tells of Coyolxauhqui's mother, the earth goddess Coatlicue, becoming miraculously pregnant. Enraged and shamed by this, Coyolxauhqui and her 400 brothers, the stars, conspired to kill their mother at the summit of the sacred mountain, Coatepec. But at the moment of their attack, Coatlicue gave birth to a fully grown, fully armed son. This was Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war. In his first act, he fought his siblings, slew his sister Coyocuatui, dismembered her body, and cast her torso from the top of the mountain. Her scattered body became the moon, forever chased from the sky by her victorious brother, the sun. The discovery of this monumental stone was the key that unlocked a lost world. The archaeologists realized that in the myth, Coyolxauhqui lies defeated at the base of the sacred mountain Coatepec. Therefore, they reasoned, if they had found this stone, they must be standing at the foot of the Templo Mayor, the architectural recreation of that sacred mountain. The lost heart of the Aztec Empire had been found. This accidental discovery triggered one of the most ambitious archaeological projects of the 20th century. The Mexican government made the momentous decision to demolish 13 colonial-era buildings that sat atop the site, to excavate the temple and reveal it to the world once more. The Proyecto Templo Mayor, the Great Temple Project, began. It was a profound statement about the identity of modern Mexico, a nation choosing to uncover its deep, pre-Hispanic roots, which had been so deliberately buried. The process of excavation was the antithesis of the violent discovery. It was an act of extreme patience and meticulous care, a slow conversation with the past. The entire area was marked out with a precise grid. Archaeologists began to remove the layers of history, not with heavy machinery, but with trowels, dental picks and brushes. Every shovelful of earth was carefully passed through fine mesh screens to catch the smallest artifacts: a tiny bead, a fishbone, a fragment of obsidian. As each new object was found, its exact location, its in situ position, was painstakingly mapped and photographed before it was ever moved. Conservators stood by, ready to treat and stabilize fragile objects of wood, shell, or fiber the moment they were exposed to the air, after 5 centuries in the dark earth. It was a slow, methodical peeling back of the layers, a search for meaning in the dust. As the tons of earth and colonial rubble were cleared away, the true form of the temple was revealed, confirming the descriptions in old Spanish chronicles. The Templo Mayor was not a single pyramid. It was a massive platform, with two structures, two temples, standing side by side at its summit, each with its own grand staircase. It was a twin pyramid, a physical manifestation of the Aztec concept of duality that governed their entire cosmos. The northern temple, which archaeologists could identify by its surviving decorative elements, was dedicated to Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain, water, fertility, and agriculture. This was the side of life, of sustenance, of the feminine power of the earth. The remnants of the shrine were painted with bands of blue and white. Sculptures found here were of creatures associated with the aquatic world: coiled serpents, frogs, and marine shells. At the top of the staircase stood a sacrificial stone, but it was different from its twin. It was a chakmul, a reclining figure of a man holding a bowl on his stomach, a type of sculpture associated with receiving offerings. The most profound discoveries on Tlaloc's side of the temple came from what lay beneath the floors. The Aztecs consecrated their sacred spaces by burying caches of offerings. These were not random assortments of valuables, but carefully curated, symbolic collections, time capsules of their worldview. In the caches dedicated to Tlaloc, archaeologists found objects that symbolically recreated his divine, watery realm. There were thousands of seashells, conches, and pieces of coral, painstakingly brought from the distant coasts of the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific, hundreds of miles away. There were the skeletons of crocodiles and sawfish, creatures of the fearsome coastal swamps. By burying these items in the heart of their high-altitude city, the Aztecs were magically transporting the ocean, the ultimate source of all water, to the base of their temple of rain. They found stone effigies of Tlaloc himself, with his signature, goggle eyes, and the fanged mouth of a jaguar. They found ritual knives and vessels, and jars filled with the seeds of vital crops like maize and amaranth, offerings to ensure a bountiful harvest. And here the archaeologists also confronted a more difficult truth of this life-giving cult. In several of the offering caches associated with Tlaloc, they found the remains of very young children. To the modern mind, it is a horrifying discovery. But to the Aztecs, there was a deeply held belief that the tears of young children were a powerful summons for rain. The small size and weeping nature of infants was thought to be pleasing to the Tlaloc, the small helper spirits of the rain god. In a world utterly dependent on seasonal rains, where a drought meant catastrophic famine and the death of thousands, this practice, however grim, was seen as a desperate, necessary transaction with the divine powers that controlled their survival. The archaeological findings were recorded with scientific detachment, but they tell a story of a people living in a state of profound environmental anxiety, willing to make the most terrible of offerings, to ensure the coming of the rains that sustained them all. On the south side of the great platform stood the second temple, a mirror image of the first, but dedicated to a very different force. This was the shrine of Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the patron god of the Mexica people, the deity of the sun, of fire, and of war. This was the side of the pyramid associated with the masculine, with the sky, with conquest, and with the tribute that flowed from it. Where Tlaloc's temple was blue and white, Huitzilopochtli's was painted in stark red and white, the colors of sacrifice and battle. Here, at the top of its grand staircase, just in front of the entrance to the shrine, archaeologists uncovered a simple, humble-looking block of volcanic stone. This was the Teccatl, the great sacrificial stone. Its design was brutally functional. It was convex, curving upwards, so that when a victim was laid upon it, their chest would be arched high, making the act of offering the heart to the sun a quicker and more efficient process. The offering caches on this side of the temple told a story of fire and blood. They were filled, not with symbols of fertility, but with the instruments and results of war. Archaeologists unearthed hundreds of ceremonial flint and obsidian knives, their blades still terrifyingly sharp after 5 centuries. Some had magnificent handles, decorated with intricate mosaics of turquoise and shell, transforming these deadly tools into objects of sacred art. They found the skulls of captured warriors, evidence of the offerings of enemy soldiers whose life force was given to feed the sun god. Some of these skulls had holes drilled on either side, indicating they were once displayed on a tzompantli, a massive skull rack that stood near the temple, a terrifying architectural feature that served as both a tribute to the gods and a chilling warning to the empire's enemies. The caches also contained objects representing fire, Huitzilopochtli's celestial counterpart. There were small statues of Huehueteotl, the old fire god, and objects made of greenstone, a material associated with heat and value. And, most tellingly, the offerings demonstrated the reach of the Aztec Empire. The priests of the Templo Mayor deposited tribute items brought from the farthest corners of their domain. They buried beautiful, enigmatic stone masks made by the Olmec civilization 1,000 years earlier, showing that the Aztecs were themselves antiquarians, who revered and collected the artifacts of even more ancient cultures. They buried objects in the Mixtec style from Oaxaca, and items from the hot coastal lowlands. The temple was not just a religious site. It was the final destination for the tribute that was the lifeblood of the empire, the center of a vast political and economic system. Perhaps the most significant discovery of the entire project was that the temple was not a single building. As archaeologists dug deeper, they found that it was constructed like a cosmic onion. Successive emperors, upon taking the throne, would build a new, larger temple directly over the top of the previous one. The project identified 7 major phases of construction and several smaller additions. Each ruler sought to outdo his predecessor, to make his own mark on the sacred center of his universe. Before beginning a new phase, the emperor would preside over a massive ceremony, dedicating the new construction with even more elaborate and rich offering caches buried within the core of the new pyramid. This practice, while destructive to the outer layers of the older temples, was a gift to archaeology. It created a sealed, stratified timeline, allowing researchers to date each layer and its offerings, and to understand the changing priorities and growing wealth of the empire over time. Deep within the core of the massive structure, they found the earliest temple, a small, humble shrine with simple offerings, dating back to the legendary founding of the city around 1325. To touch its stones was to reach back to the very beginning of the Aztec story. Today, the excavated ruins of the Templo Mayor lie open to the sky in the heart of Mexico City. They sit in a great, sunken pit, directly beside the imposing stone walls of the Spanish Cathedral and the National Palace. The juxtaposition is powerful and profound. It is a raw, visible scar and a testament to the city's layered and often violent history. The temple is no longer a place of active ritual, but it remains a place of immense power. It is a place of quiet contemplation, where the echoes of a lost cosmology, the duality of rain and sun, of life and death, of fertility and war, can still be felt. The accidental discovery by an electrical worker in 1978 did more than unearth a building. It recovered a foundational story of the Mexican nation, a complex and difficult narrative written in stone, in shell, in obsidian and in bone, allowing a direct and unflinching conversation with a magnificent and terrifying past. A gilded cage, the life of a Pochteca merchant in the intricate social fabric of the Aztec Empire. Power and privilege were not always what they seemed. While the Tlatoani ruled from his palace and the high priests communed with the gods atop their pyramids, another group moved through the arteries of the empire, a class apart, living in a world of immense wealth, profound secrecy, and constant, mortal danger. They were technically commoners, yet their influence could shape the fate of nations. These were the Pochteca, the long-distance merchants of Tenochtitlan. To understand the Pochteca is to understand a fundamental paradox of Aztec society. They were not the humble vendors of the local marketplace, selling maize, pottery, or textiles for daily use. They were members of a highly organized, hereditary, and exclusive guild that dealt only in the most exotic and precious luxury goods. Their trade brought the shimmering green feathers of the quetzal, the precious jadeite stone, the jaguar pelts, and the vital cacao beans from the farthest reaches of Mesoamerica into the heart of the capital. This trade made them wealthy, sometimes accumulating riches that far surpassed those of the traditional warrior nobility, and this was the source of their precarious position. In a society rigidly structured around noble lineage and military prowess, the Pochteca represented a different kind of power, the power of commerce. They were both essential to the state, which craved the luxury goods they provided, and deeply suspect for the very wealth they generated. As a result, their entire culture was built upon a foundation of discretion and an elaborate performance of humility. From a young age, a Pochteca was taught to be unassuming, to never flaunt their wealth, to speak humbly, and to dress in public in the coarse cloaks of an ordinary commoner. To do otherwise, to appear arrogant, or to challenge the established order, was to invite the dangerous envy of the warrior class, an envy that could easily lead to ruin, expropriation of their goods, or even death. Theirs was a life lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by treasure that could only be enjoyed in the shadows. The Pochteca lived together in their own designated quarters within the great cities. In Tenochtitlan and its sister city of Tlatelolco, these districts were known as Pochlan. These were not just neighborhoods, they were self-contained communities, worlds within worlds. Here, among their own kind, the rules were different. The Pochteca had their own laws and their own courts to settle commercial disputes. They had their own temples, dedicated to their own pantheon of gods. Their chief deity was Yakatecutli, whose name means, the Lord who guides, or Lord of the Nose, signifying his role in going before the caravan. His symbol was the traveler's staff, a simple bundle of sticks that became a sacred object, a portable idol during their long journeys. A Pochteca household was a place of carefully managed contrasts. To the outside world, a merchant's house might appear modest, a standard one-story adobe structure, indistinguishable from his neighbors. But once one passed through the unassuming doorway into the private interior courtyard, the reality of their wealth would be revealed. Here, the air might be thick with the scent of rare incense. The gardens would be filled not with maize and beans, but with exotic flowers and fragrant herbs. Caged tropical birds, like parrots and macaws, brought back from the hot lowlands, would fill the air with their calls. The family members, once inside their compound, would shed their rough outer cloaks and don garments of fine embroidered cotton. They would wear jewelry of gold, amber, and polished greenstone. And hidden within the compound were the storehouses, the petlakali, windowless rooms packed to the rafters with the incredible treasures acquired on their last expedition, awaiting the right moment for a discreet sale to a noble or the royal palace itself. This domestic world was a secret sanctuary of luxury, a stark contrast to the humble persona they were forced to present to the world outside. The defining event in a Pochteca's life was the expedition. A trading journey was not a casual affair, it was a monumental undertaking, often planned for years, that was equal parts commercial enterprise, military operation, and religious pilgrimage. The process began with the complex assembling of capital. A senior merchant, the leader of the expedition, would summon other merchants of his guild, and they would pool their resources, contributing vast quantities of trade goods to be carried out. These were the manufactured treasures of the Aztec heartland, exquisite jewelry, tools and mirrors of polished black obsidian, intricately woven and dyed cotton textiles, and the precious crimson dye made from the cochineal insect. With their goods assembled, the next task was to hire the porters, the tlamema. In a world without the wheel for transport and without any beasts of burden, every single item, from a single feather to a massive bale of cotton, had to be carried on the back of a human being. The tlama were professional porters, immensely strong men who could carry loads of 50 pounds or more for days on end. They used a pen conta side device called a cacaxli, a simple wooden frame that rested on their back. Supported by a tumpline, a strap passed across the forehead. This allowed them to bear incredible weights, but the physical toll was immense. A large expedition might employ hundreds, or even thousands of these porters, forming a human train that could stretch for miles. Before the expedition could depart, a series of complex and expensive rituals had to be performed. The lead merchants would host a great feast for the members of their guild and their families. This was a public display of their commitment, but even here the tone was one of humility. They would speak of the dangers of the journey, and the uncertainty of their return. They would undergo long fasts and offer prayers and incense to their god Yakatecutli. The traveling staves of all the participating merchants would be gathered together, bundled and placed in a shrine in the lead merchant's house. This bundle of sticks, the Yakatecutli in Iyetl, was now the living embodiment of the god, a sacred object that would be carried at the head of the caravan and venerated each night of the journey. The merchants consulted the calendar priests to determine the most auspicious day and hour for their departure, for to leave under a bad omen was to court disaster. The departure itself was shrouded in secrecy. The caravan would assemble and leave the city in the dead of night, slipping out through the causeways under the cover of darkness. This was to avoid drawing attention, to prevent thieves from knowing the route, and to maintain their public facade of modesty. The first part of the journey was the slow climb out of the high, cool valley of Mexico. The porters, bent under their heavy loads, would move in a steady, shuffling gait up the steep mountain passes, the thin air burning in their lungs. The landscape was one of pine and oak forests, familiar and relatively safe. But once they crossed the mountain ranges that ringed the valley, they descended into a different world. They entered the tonal Tecatl, the hot lands, the tropical lowlands that stretched towards the coasts. Here, the air grew thick, humid, and heavy. The vegetation changed to a dense, suffocating jungle. The sounds were different: the rasping of insects, the chatter of monkeys, the guttural cry of a jaguar in the distance. This part of the journey was fraught with danger. These were often hostile territories, home to peoples who chafed under Aztec rule, or who were outright enemies of the empire. The Pochateca had to be skilled diplomats, negotiating safe passage, offering gifts to local chieftains, and always being wary of betrayal. Their caravans were heavily armed, with the merchants themselves and hired guards acting as a military escort, ready to fend off an ambush at any moment. The dangers were not all human. There were the natural perils of the jungle, venomous snakes like the fer de lance, crocodiles in the rivers they had to cross, and the common epidemic, constant threat of tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever, for which they had no defense. The daily grind was relentless. Each day was an endless march through sweltering heat. Each night a defensible camp had to be established, sentries had to be posted, and every single night, rituals had to be performed before the sacred bundle of staves, offering prayers and incense to Yakatacutli for his continued protection. A journey to the rich trading centers on the Gulf Coast or the Pacific coast of Guatemala could take many months, even a year, and many who set out would not return. Upon reaching their destination, a major trading hub like Xcalanco on the Gulf Coast, or a city in the Mayan lands of the Yucatan, the art of the trade began. In a world without currency, commerce was a complex dance of barter and negotiation. The value of goods was calculated against certain recognized standards, primarily the quachli, a type of standardized cotton cloak, or, for smaller transactions, a certain number of cacao beans. The Pochateca would display their highland goods, and the local merchants would present theirs. The negotiations would be slow, formal, and conducted with great ceremony. It was for the goods of the lowlands that the Pochateca had risked everything. And these goods were the stuff of legend in Tenochtitlan. First and foremost were the feathers, especially the long, iridescent tail feathers of the male resplendent quetzal. These shimmering green plumes, which seemed to change color in the light, were the most precious commodity in the Aztec world, reserved for the regalia of the emperor and the highest-ranking nobles. The merchants also sought raw cacao beans, the source of the bitter, invigorating drink of the elite, which also served as a useful currency. They traded for jaguar pelts, the symbol of the highest warrior orders. They acquired precious stones like jadeite and other greenstones, which were believed to hold sacred life force. They sought raw rubber, which was used to make the balls for the ritual ball game. They traded for the brilliant red dye of the cochineal insect and the vibrant yellow of amber. These were the raw materials of power, the symbols that visually reinforced the social hierarchy back in the capital. But the Pochateca often carried a second, secret mandate. Their long-distance trading missions were frequently a cover for state-sponsored espionage. Because they were merchants, they could travel into territories where Aztec soldiers could not go. While they were negotiating for goods, they were also gathering intelligence for the emperor. They would learn the local languages, map the terrain, assess the fortifications of a city, estimate its military strength, and identify any political factions that might be open to an alliance with the Aztecs. They were the eyes and ears of the empire. An insult or an attack on a Pochateca caravan was often used by the Aztec state as a casus belli, a formal justification for launching a military invasion. The merchants were the tip of the spear, the vanguard whose commercial activities paved the way for military conquest. After many months, or even years, the expedition would begin its long, perilous journey home, now laden with the treasures of the south. Their return to Tenochtitlan was conducted with the same secrecy as their departure. They would enter the city under the cloak of night, spiriting their precious cargo away to their locked storehouses, unseen by prying eyes. What followed was a remarkable piece of social theatre. The lead merchant would again host a feast for his guild, but instead of boasting of his success, he would put on a display of abject misery. He would weep, tear his clothes and complain of the terrible hardships of the road, the bandits, the diseases. He would lament that the expedition was a financial disaster, that they had barely managed to break even. His guests, all members of the guild, understood the performance and would play along, commiserating with his supposed misfortune. This ritual of concealment was absolutely critical. It was a formal demonstration to the rest of Aztec society, especially the warrior nobility, that the Pochteca were not getting above their station. It was a way of managing the social tension created by their immense wealth. They had to pretend to be poor, to be allowed to remain rich. Theirs was a strange bifurcated existence, a life of incredible hardship and danger on the road, rewarded with treasures that could only be enjoyed in secret. They were the architects of the empire's commercial power, and the agents of its expansion, yet they had to live in a state of constant performance, their true power and influence forever hidden behind a carefully constructed mask of humility. The Pochteca were the masters of a world of whispered negotiations and hidden storehouses, their lives a testament to the complex, and often contradictory, social pressures that held the magnificent Aztec world together. The floating city, the engineering of Tenochtitlan. To truly comprehend the world of the Aztecs, the daily life of the farmer, the rituals of the priest, the secret journeys of the merchant, we must first understand the ground beneath their feet, or, more accurately, we must understand the water that cradled their civilization. The city of Tenochtitlan was more than a collection of buildings. It was a triumph of engineering, a man-made ecosystem wrested from an environment that most other cultures would have deemed uninhabitable. It was, in the truest sense, an impossible city. Let us return to the very beginning, to the arrival of the wandering Mexica people in the Valley of Mexico in the 13th century. They were latecomers, a semi-nomadic tribe in a valley already populated by powerful and sophisticated city-states. All the best land, the fertile plains, the forested foothills, was already claimed. All that was left for these outsiders was a swampy, snake-infested, and thoroughly undesirable island in the middle of a vast lake. To the established powers of the valley, assigning this land to the Mexica was an act of containment, a way to isolate them. But for the Mexica, this marginal land presented a challenge that would spark centuries of breathtaking innovation. Survival demanded that they become masters of their aquatic world. To grasp their achievement, we must first understand the lake itself. Lake Texcoco was not a single uniform body of water. It was a complex hydrological system of 5 interconnected lakes, each with its own character. The northern lakes were the most saline, their waters brackish and unsuitable for agriculture. The southern lakes, Chalco and Xochimilco, however, were fed by fresh mountain springs and were teeming with life. Tenochtitlan was founded in the saline part of the system. The Mexica were therefore faced with a series of critical problems. How could they grow enough food on a small, marshy island? How could they build a major city on soft, unstable ground? How could they connect their island capital to the mainland? And how could they secure a source of fresh drinking water when they were surrounded by salt? The solutions they devised to these problems are a testament to their remarkable ingenuity and their profound understanding of the natural world. The first and most fundamental challenge was food. The answer was the Chanampa, the system of artificial agricultural islands that we have touched upon, but whose engineering deserves a much deeper exploration. A Chinampa was not a raft, and it did not float freely. It was a feat of land reclamation, a method of building solid arable land in the shallow waters of the lake. The process began with a survey of the lakebed. A master Chinampa builder would sound the depths with a long pole, identifying a suitable shallow area for construction. Once a location was chosen, the workers would begin by driving long, durable stakes of a huixotl, the water willow tree, deep into the mud. They would drive these stakes in rows, forming a large rectangular enclosure, often as long as 30 meters, and as wide as 2 or 3. The choice of willow wood was critical. It was water-resistant, but more importantly, it was alive. The stakes, once planted in the rich lakebed, would often sprout, growing into mature trees whose dense root systems would form a powerful, living wall, permanently anchoring the chinampa and preventing erosion. With the perimeter established, the laborious process of filling it began. This was done in careful layers. The first layers were typically composed of alternating bands of dredged mud from the bottom of the canal and decaying aquatic vegetation, water hyacinths, reeds, and algae. The heavier mud provided a stable, solid base, while the decaying organic matter created a nutrient-rich, almost compost-like soil. This layering continued until the surface of the new island rose about a meter above the water level. The result was a plot of land of almost miraculous fertility, a perfectly contained, self-irrigating garden. The soil was so porous and rich that the roots of the crops could draw moisture directly from the surrounding canals, eliminating any need for manual watering. The process was also self-sustaining. As the Chinamperos regularly dredged the canals to clear them for canoe traffic, they would pile the rich new mud and decaying plants onto the garden beds, constantly replenishing the soil's nutrients. This system was an agricultural powerhouse. The stable water level, the constant supply of moisture, and the incredibly fertile soil allowed for a level of productivity that was unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. On a single chinampa plot, a farmer could achieve up to 7 different harvests a year. While one crop was being harvested, another was being planted, and a third was already sprouting. This incredible efficiency is what fed the massive population of Tenochtitlan, a city that, at its height, was home to over 200,000 people. The Chinampa system was the stomach of the city, the silent, green engine that powered the entire Aztec enterprise. It transformed a useless swamp into the most productive farmland in the Americas. With the problem of food solved, the next challenge was isolation. An island capital, to be effective, must be connected to the mainland territories from which it draws tribute and resources. The solution was the construction of the calzadas, the great stone causeways. These were not mere paths but massive feats of civil engineering, wide, straight avenues that strode confidently across the open water of the lake. The construction of a causeway was a monumental undertaking. The engineers would begin by driving 2 parallel rows of thick wooden pilings deep into the soft lakebed, marking the edges of the road. These pilings served as a retaining wall. The enormous gap between these 2 walls, which could be as wide as 15 meters, or about 45 feet, was then filled. An army of laborers would bring millions of tons of rock, clay, earth and rubble, likely transported by canoe from the mainland, and dump it into the enclosure. This material was packed down tightly, layer by layer, until the roadbed rose several feet above the highest water level, creating a stable, dry path across the lake. The surfaces were then carefully paved with stone, or covered with packed earth, creating a smooth and durable roadway. 3 main causeways served Tenochtitlan, linking it to the mainland in a great T-shape. The shortest was the western causeway to the city of Tlacopan, a key ally. To the north, a causeway ran to Tepeyac, the site of a major religious shrine. But the most important was the Great Southern Causeway, a massive structure that ran for over 5 miles, connecting the capital to the mainland city of Iztapalapa. This was the main artery for the flow of goods and tribute from the rich agricultural lands of the Curly, Southern Valley. These causeways were more than just transportation routes. They were also brilliant pieces of strategic military design. The Aztec engineers built them with built-in vulnerabilities. At regular intervals along each causeway, the stone structure was replaced by a wide wooden bridge. In times of peace, these bridges allowed canoe traffic to pass freely from one side of the causeway to the other, but in times of war, they could be quickly removed. By pulling up these bridges, the Aztecs could effectively sever the connections to the mainland, turning their city into an easily defended fortress. The very causeways that allowed the empire's wealth to flow in could be transformed in an instant into impenetrable walls. This feature would prove absolutely critical and ultimately tragic during the final siege of the city by the Spanish. The greatest engineering challenge the Aztecs faced, however, was the management of water itself. The city's location in a saline lake, in a valley prone to massive flooding, presented a dual threat. The solution to this was perhaps their most ambitious project of all, the Great Dike of Nezahualcoyotl. The problem was complex. The lake system was fed by mountain streams, and during the rainy season, the volume of water could swell dramatically, causing the lakes to overflow their banks and flood the city, sometimes with catastrophic results. Furthermore, this floodwater was often saline from the northern lakes, which, if it inundated the Chinampas, could poison the soil. To solve this, the Huitlatawani of Tenochtitlan formed an alliance with the legendary philosopher king of the neighboring city of Texcoco, Nezahualcoyotl, who was renowned for his wisdom and engineering prowess. Together, they conceived of a plan of staggering scale. They designed a massive dike or levee that would run for 10 miles, north to south, across a narrow part of the lake, effectively partitioning it in two. The construction was an immense logistical feat, requiring a workforce of thousands. It was built of earth and stone, reinforced with a double palisade of wooden pilings. The dike was not a solid wall. It was fitted with wooden sluice gates that could be opened or closed, allowing the Aztecs to control the flow of water between the two halves of the lake. This dike served two vital functions. First, it was a massive flood barrier, protecting Tenochtitlan from the storm surges that originated in the larger eastern part of Lake Texcoco. Second, and just as importantly, it was a feat of hydraulic desalination. It isolated the waters immediately surrounding the city from the main saline body of the lake. Over time, the fresh water flowing into this newly created western lagoon from the southern springs, and from rainfall, diluted the salt content, creating a more controlled and favorable aquatic environment for the Chinampa agriculture. The Dike of Nezahualcóyotl was a monument to their ability to think on a regional scale, to liman, tame the very nature of their world through sheer force of will and collaborative engineering. Finally, there was the problem of drinking water. Despite being a city on a lake, Tenochtitlan had no natural source of fresh, potable water. The lake water, even in the lagoon created by the dike, was not clean enough to drink. The solution was another masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, the Chapultepec aqueduct. From the abundant freshwater springs on the mainland at Chapultepec, or Grasshopper Hill, the Aztecs constructed a great aqueduct that ran for over 3 miles, across the marshy land and open water, directly into the heart of the city. But it was not a simple, open channel, like the Roman aqueducts. The Aztec design was, in some ways, more sophisticated. It consisted of 2 parallel pipes, or channels, constructed from stone and compacted clay, running side by side. This brilliant twin-channel system had a very practical purpose. It allowed for continuous, uninterrupted service. The city authorities could dam one of the channels to allow it to be cleaned and maintained, while the other channel continued to supply fresh water to the city's inhabitants. Once the maintenance was complete, they could switch the flow back to the first channel and clean the second. The aqueduct didn't feed directly into homes. It terminated at public fountains and reservoirs, located at key points within the city. From these locations, a class of professional water sellers would fill large clay jars, load them into their canoes, and then paddle through the vast network of canals, distributing fresh drinking water to every neighborhood. When we put all these pieces together, the image of Tenochtitlan that emerges is not of a city simply built on a lake, but of a city that was a living, breathing, and completely engineered aquatic ecosystem. The Chinas fed it, the causeways connected it, the dike protected it, and the aqueduct gave it drink. Each system was a brilliant solution to a deadly problem, and all were interconnected, creating a delicate but highly effective balance. This was the Aztec worldview, made manifest in stone, earth, and water. It was an act of imposing a human, ordered world onto the chaos of the natural environment, a physical parallel to their religious quest to maintain cosmic order through ritual. Yet, for all its brilliance, the system was fragile. It depended entirely on constant, painstaking maintenance, and on the absolute social cohesion and political control needed to mobilize vast amounts of labor. When that control was finally broken, this magnificent water-bound world, a wonder of the ancient world, proved tragically and heartbreakingly unsustainable. Tribute and cacao beans. The Aztec economic system. The great city of Tenochtitlan, with its soaring temples, its meticulously engineered gardens, and its vast population, was a hungry city. Its appetite was not for food alone. It was an entity that consumed wealth, prestige, and the raw materials of power. This insatiable hunger was fed by a vast, highly organized, and relentless system of economic extraction known as tribute. To understand the Aztec Empire is to understand that its economy was fundamentally a war economy, and tribute was the dividend paid on military victory. While bustling local markets, or tianquizli, were a vital part of daily life, allowing common people to barter for pottery, food, and simple tools, the grand economy of the state operated on a different principle entirely. It was not driven by the free exchange of goods, but by the systematic collection of taxes levied upon the dozens of provinces and hundreds of city-states that had been conquered by the formidable Aztec military machine. The constant, massive influx of tribute from across Mesoamerica was the lifeblood of the empire. It funded the lavish lifestyles of the emperor and the nobility. It supplied the armies with their magnificent costumes and weapons. It provided the raw materials for the artisans, and it fed the very gods through endless, elaborate ritual offerings. The entire state apparatus was designed to ensure that the wealth of a vast and diverse land flowed in one direction, toward the capital. At its height in the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire was a tapestry of some 38 tributary provinces. The process of becoming one of these provinces was straightforward and brutal. It began with war. An Aztec army, a terrifyingly efficient and disciplined force, would descend upon a city-state, and through either intimidation or outright battle, subdue it. But the goal of Aztec warfare was rarely annihilation or total occupation in the modern sense. The primary objective was to ensure the defeated state would be seamlessly integrated into the imperial tribute system. Once the battle was won, and allegiance was sworn, the Aztec military would depart. In their place, a different kind of functionary would arrive. These were the imperial administrators, the tribute collectors, known as the Calpixc. The Calpixc were the permanent Aztec presence in a conquered land, the face of the empire for the local populace. They were often feared, and universally disliked, for their role was to oversee the systematic extraction of wealth from the province, and ensure it was delivered, on time and in full, to Tenochtitlan. The assessment of tribute was not an arbitrary or haphazard process. It was a sophisticated, resource-based form of taxation. The Calpixc did not impose a uniform tax on every province. Instead, they conducted a careful survey of the region's natural resources, its agricultural output, and the specialized skills of its artisans. A coastal province, rich in sea life but poor in timber, would be taxed in goods like dried fish, sea salt, and beautiful ornate seashells. A mountainous region in the highlands, covered in pine forests, might be required to provide thousands of wooden beams and planks for construction projects in the capital, along with the pelts of local animals. A province that was home to a famous tradition of pottery making would be taxed not in raw clay, but in thousands of finished, high-quality ceramic vessels. This system was ruthlessly efficient, designed to exploit the unique economic strengths of every corner of the empire. This entire system was recorded and managed through a remarkable form of bureaucracy, the painted books or codices. Surviving examples, like the famous Codex Mendoza, which was created just after the Spanish conquest, provide a stunningly detailed window into this economic machine. Imagine a single page from such a codex. In the margins you would see a series of glyphs, pictorial symbols, each representing a specific town within the newly conquered province. The main body of the page would then be filled with more pictograms, a visual invoice of the tribute owed by that entire province. The system of notation was simple and clear. Beside the image of a product, a series of symbols would indicate the quantity required. A small symbol resembling a feather meant a quantity of 400. Thus, an image of a bundle of chili peppers next to the feather symbol meant that 400 bundles were due. A symbol of a flag meant a quantity of 20. Other symbols denoted different measures. A small drawing of a warrior's shield, decorated with an intricate feather mosaic, would simply stand for itself. The page would be a visual spreadsheet, a clear and unambiguous record of the province's obligation to the state. These codices were the ledgers of the empire, a testament to a bureaucracy that could manage a continental economy without an alphabetic script. To read through the tribute lists of the Aztec Empire is to take a grand tour of the wealth of Mesoamerica. The sheer variety and volume of goods is staggering. First, there were the staple goods. While the Chinampas of Tenochtitlan were incredibly productive, the city's demand for food was endless. From the agricultural heartlands, vast quantities of maize, beans, chia seeds, and amaranth were demanded. These would be delivered in immense woven bins, destined for the great imperial storehouses, the Petlacalco. From these storehouses, the grain would be used to feed the thousands of inhabitants of the royal palace, and it would also be redistributed as payment to state laborers working on temples and causeways. An even more common form of tribute was textiles. The lists demand almost unbelievable quantities of cotton cloaks, the quatli. Tens of thousands of them were due from various provinces every year. These were not all the same. There were simple, plain white cloaks for outfitting the lower classes and state workers. There were cloaks woven with intricate geometric patterns in brilliant colors, destined for mid-ranking officials or warriors. And there were cloaks of the highest quality, decorated with potent divine symbols, reserved for the highest echelons of the Texer nobility. In a world without metal currency, these textiles, particularly the standardized quatli, functioned as a form of wealth, a unit of exchange for large transactions, and a visible marker of social status. Perhaps the most spectacular category of tribute was the requirement for finished warrior costumes. Provinces were taxed not just in raw materials, but in complete, ready-to-wear military regalia for the elite Aztec warrior societies. A single page in the Codex Mendoza might demand 20 complete jaguar night costumes. Imagine what this entailed: the hunting and skinning of 20 jaguars, the tanning of their pelts, and the meticulous crafting of the skins into a terrifying uniform, complete with the snarling head worn as a helmet. The same page might demand an equal number of eagle night costumes, requiring the collection of thousands upon thousands of eagle feathers, which were then painstakingly affixed to a fabric suit to create a feathered warrior. Alongside these, a province would be required to deliver ornate shields, their surfaces decorated with dazzling and intricate mosaics made from the tiniest, most brilliant hummingbird feathers. This was a form of taxation that directly supplied the Aztec war machine, outfitting its most prestigious fighters in the symbols of their power. And then there were the luxury goods, the items that filled the palaces of the nobility, with color, scent, and prestige. The tribute lists call for strings of jadeite and greenstone beads, the most precious of all materials to the Aztecs, more highly valued than gold. They call for raw gold, not as coin but as dust, carefully measured and stored in the clear quills of birds. They call for bags of cochineal dye, the source of the most brilliant crimson red. They demand blocks of raw copal resin, which was burned as a sacred incense, its fragrant smoke a food for the gods. They call for bowls of shimmering turquoise mosaic tiles, destined to be inlaid into masks and ceremonial weapons. The lists go on and on. Amber, rock crystal, rubber balls for the sacred game, and thousands of elegant seashells. This vast logistical operation of collection and transport was a marvel of organization. In each province, the Calpix and his staff would oversee the gathering of the goods from the various towns under his jurisdiction. He would inspect them for quality and store them in a local warehouse. Periodically, typically every 80 days or every 6 months depending on the province, a great caravan would be assembled to transport the accumulated tribute to the capital. Again, without draft animals, this entire operation depended on the strength of the human back. Long lines of Tlamima porters, each carrying their regulated 50-pound load, would snake their way across the empire. Imagine the sight. A line of men stretching for miles, some carrying massive bins of grain, others with carefully balanced stacks of folded textiles, others bearing the magnificent, feather-covered warrior costumes on frames, making them look like a procession of mythological beasts. The journey was slow, arduous, and a testament to the state's ability to mobilize and coordinate immense amounts of human labor. Upon arrival in Tenochtitlan, the caravan would be met by another set of imperial officials. The cargo would be carefully unloaded and meticulously counted. The officials would hold up their own copy of the tribute codex, checking each and every item against the painted list, ensuring that the province had fulfilled its obligation to the last bead and the last feather. Once approved, the goods would disappear into the vast labyrinth of the imperial storehouses, ready to be deployed as the emperor saw fit. While this grand tribute system defined the economy of the state, a different, more fluid system governed the daily lives of ordinary people, In the bustling marketplaces, the primary form of exchange was simple barter. A potter might trade a clay vessel for a certain quantity of beans from a farmer, but for more precise transactions, a form of currency was needed. For the Aztecs, this currency was the cacao bean. Cacao beans, the source of the elite chocolate drink, were the perfect medium of exchange. They were lightweight, portable, relatively durable, and could be easily counted and divided. Their value was understood by everyone. A commoner, wanting to buy a few items in the market, would carry a small bag of cacao beans. We have records that give us a sense of their value. One large ripe tomato might cost a single cacao bean. A turkey egg might be worth 3 beans. A full-grown turkey could be purchased for 200 beans. For larger purchases, like a canoe or a fine cotton cloak, the price would be calculated in the hundreds or even thousands of beans. The system was so established that it even had its own problem with counterfeiters. Unscrupulous individuals were known to carefully slice open a cacao bean, remove the valuable meat inside, fill the shell with dirt or sand, and carefully glue it back together. This use of cacao as both a luxury good and a unit of currency demonstrates the dual nature of the Aztec economy. At the top, a vast state-controlled command economy based on the extraction of tribute from conquered lands. At the bottom, a vibrant local market economy based on barter and the exchange of small, valuable beans. Both systems were essential, and both fed the great city. The tribute system was an economy of pure power, a constant, tangible demonstration of Tenochtitlan's dominance over its empire. The flow of goods was not a transaction. It was a confirmation of a political reality, a physical manifestation of the order that placed the Mexica at the very center of the universe, a universe whose treasures were destined to be laid at the feet of their hungry, victorious gods. The unforgiving code, law and order in the Aztec world, the same powerful impulse for order that drove the Aztec people to engineer an entire ecosystem on a lake, and to systematize the flow of tribute across a continent, also compelled them to create one of the most rigid and comprehensive legal codes in the ancient world. In the Aztec worldview, a crime was not simply an offense committed by one person against another. It was an act of cosmic imbalance. It was a chaotic intrusion into a meticulously ordered society, a tear in the fragile fabric of the community that, if left untended, threatened to unravel the whole. The law, therefore, was not merely a tool for resolving disputes. It was a sacred instrument for maintaining the health of the social body, and by extension, the stability of the universe itself. The philosophical foundation of Aztec law was the preservation of the established hierarchy and the maintenance of absolute public order. Its primary function was to be a powerful and unambiguous deterrent. The modern concept of rehabilitation, of reforming an offender, was largely absent from their thinking. The goal was purification. A criminal element within the society was seen as a sickness, and the only way to restore health was to remove that element swiftly and decisively. The laws themselves were not seen as the arbitrary commands of the current emperor. They were believed to be an ancient and sacred inheritance, a code of conduct handed down from the revered Toltec ancestors, the legendary civilization that the Aztecs regarded as the source of all wisdom and legitimate authority. This ancient code was sanctified by the gods, and to break the law was to not only defy the Tlatoani, but to defy the divine order of creation. This deep reverence for order was reflected in the structure of the court system itself, a clear hierarchy of justice that mirrored the hierarchical structure of Aztec society. For the vast majority of common people, justice began at the local level, within the Calpulli. As we have seen, the Calpulli was the neighborhood district, a close-knit community of families that served as the primary unit of social organization. Within each Calpulli, a council of respected elders, often seasoned warriors or former community leaders, would preside over a local tribunal. This court dealt with the minor frictions of daily life, a dispute between two families over the boundary of their chinampas, an accusation of petty theft of a few ears of maize, a public insult exchanged in anger. The goal here was not always harsh punishment, but reconciliation. The elders sought to restore harmony within their community, to find a solution that would allow neighbors to continue living side by side. The sentences might involve public apology, the payment of restitution, or a stern warning. A more specialized form of local justice could be found in the great marketplaces, particularly the sprawling, chaotic market of Tlatelolco. where tens of thousands of people gathered daily. To maintain order in such a volatile environment, a dedicated court operated within the market itself. A panel of 3 to 12 judges, usually senior and respected merchants, sat in a designated chamber every single day. They were empowered to render immediate judgment on any commercial dispute that arose. If a customer accused a vendor of using false weights or measures, or if an argument broke out over the agreed-upon price of a pot or a blanket, the parties would be brought immediately before the market court. Justice was swift and public, designed to prevent minor disagreements from escalating into brawls, and to ensure that the vital commercial life of the city could proceed in an orderly fashion. For more serious crimes, a citizen would find themselves in a Tekoli court. This was the formal trial court for a specific city district, presided over by professional, state-appointed judges, who were typically members of the nobility. The proceedings in a Tekali court were formal and methodical. An accuser would bring their case, and the accused would be summoned to answer. Witnesses were called to give testimony under a solemn oath to the gods. To lie before the court, to commit perjury, was itself considered a capital offense, a profound insult to the divine nature of justice. Evidence could include the testimony of these witnesses, confessions from the accused, or even pictorial evidence from painted codices that might detail a land agreement or a debt. There were no professional lawyers to argue the case. Both the accuser and the accused spoke for themselves. After hearing the evidence, the judges would confer and deliver their verdict. This process was usually remarkably quick, often taking place in a single day. At the very pinnacle of the legal pyramid was the High Court, known as the Tlaxitlan. Located within the imperial palace in Tenochtitlan, this was the supreme court of the empire. It was presided over by the most powerful man in the empire besides the emperor himself, the Chihuacoatl, or woman serpent. This court served as the court of appeal, though in a system designed for swift finality, appeals were exceptionally rare. Its primary function was to serve as the court of first instance, for all cases involving the high nobility. An accusation of treason against a high-ranking warrior, or a major crime committed by a member of the emperor's own family would be tried here, away from the public gaze of the lower courts. The Huitlatawani himself stood as the ultimate judge, the final arbiter of all law. While he could overturn any verdict, he rarely intervened directly, preferring to let the established legal hierarchy function as it was designed, a perfect, orderly machine of justice. The laws this machine enforced were comprehensive, and, by any modern standard, extraordinarily harsh. They can be understood by grouping them into categories based on the aspect of social order they were meant to protect. First were the crimes against the state, which were considered the most heinous of all. Treason, defined as any act that threatened the authority of the Tlatoani, or the security of the empire, was punished with the utmost severity. A noble found guilty of conspiring with an enemy city-state, for instance, would face certain death. But the punishment did not end with him. Often his entire extended family would also be executed, a brutal but effective method of eliminating any possibility of future blood feuds or challenges to the throne. All of the traitor's property, his lands, his home, his luxury goods, would be confiscated by the state. In a tribute-based economy, crimes related to taxation were also treated as crimes against the state. A commoner who repeatedly failed to provide his share of tribute could be forced into slavery. A tribute collector, the Kelpix, caught embezzling the goods he was entrusted with, had betrayed the public trust, and would be swiftly put to death. Next were the crimes against the strict social and moral order, which the Aztecs believed were essential for preventing societal decay. Chief among these was public drunkenness. While the fermented cactus drink, pulque, was consumed, its use was tightly controlled. It was permitted for the elderly, who were seen as having earned the right to relax their inhibitions, and it was allowed during specific, state-sanctioned religious festivals. But for an ordinary citizen, and especially for a young person, to be found intoxicated in public was a grave offense. The Aztecs saw drunkenness as the gateway to chaos. It led to idleness, violence, and sexual immorality. A first offense for a commoner might result in public humiliation, such as having their head shaved, and the symbolic destruction of their home. A second offense could be punishable by death. For a noble, who was expected to be a model of stoic self-control, a single act of public drunkenness could be a capital crime. Similarly, adultery was seen as a profound attack on the integrity of the family. the foundational unit of Aztec society. It was punished with extreme prejudice. If a man and woman were found guilty of adultery, both faced the death penalty. The method of execution varied by region, but often involved public stoning or strangulation, a terrifying spectacle designed to reinforce the sanctity of marriage vows. Theft was also punished severely, with the penalty often fitting the crime's context. A thief caught in the act in the bustling Tlatelolco market might be beaten to death on the spot by the enraged crowd of vendors, a form of summary justice that was tacitly approved by the authorities. Stealing items of high value or sacred importance, such as maize from a farmer's field, the food of the gods, or a valuable object from a temple, was an automatic capital offense. For crimes against persons, the law was equally direct. Homicide was, unsurprisingly, a capital crime, and the guilty party was typically executed. Slander and gossip, while seeming minor to a modern observer, were taken very seriously. In a pharmacia, society built on reputation and social standing, maliciously damaging a person's good name was a significant offense, and could be punished with corporal mutilation, such as having one's lips publicly cut off. A key feature of the Aztec legal system was its two-tiered nature, with different standards for nobles and commoners. However, contrary to what one might expect, the nobility was often held to a stricter standard. Because nobles were expected to be paragons of virtue and self-control, their moral failures were seen as more corrosive to society than those of a commoner. Therefore, a noble found guilty of a major crime like adultery or theft would be shown no mercy. Their execution was certain, but to preserve the dignity of their class, it was often carried out in private, typically by strangulation, rather than through a messy and shameful public stoning. The concept of slavery, or tlacotin, also existed within this legal framework, but it was a fundamentally different institution from the chattel slavery that would later be practiced in the Americas. In the Aztec world, slavery was not a permanent, inherited, or race-based condition. It was a legal status one could enter for a variety of reasons. It could be a punishment for a crime, such as a thief being sentenced to serve the person they had robbed. It was also a common outcome for failure to pay debts. A person could even sell themselves or a family member into slavery voluntarily. During a famine, a desperate family might sell a child into servitude for a fixed price, allowing the rest of the family to survive. A compulsive gambler who lost everything might be forced to pay his debts by becoming the slave of the winner. Crucially, Aztec slaves or tlacotin had legal rights. They could marry whomever they chose, they could have their own children who were born free, they could own property, and they could even own their own slaves. A slave who accumulated enough wealth had the legal right to purchase their own freedom. The entire system was more akin to a form of long-term indentured servitude or penal labor than the absolute ownership of another human being. It was a legal and economic status, not an existential one. In summary, the Aztec legal system was a foundational pillar of their state, as essential to its function as the army or the priesthood. It was undeniably harsh, designed to be swift, decisive, and unforgiving. Its primary purpose was not to achieve justice in a compassionate or rehabilitative sense, but to preserve a specific, divinely sanctioned social order through the powerful tool of fear. This created a society that was, by all accounts, remarkably stable and safe from common crime. The streets of Tenochtitlan were famously orderly. Yet, it was an order built on a brittle foundation. It left little room for mercy, for individuality, or for dissent. Like the city's magnificent but rigid engineering, the Aztec legal system was an impressive structure, but it lacked the flexibility to adapt to the chaotic, unpredictable, and unprecedented reality of the Spanish invasion. Faced with a force that obeyed no laws but its own, this strict and brittle order, and the society it held together, would be completely and irrevocably shattered. Whispers of Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec belief system. The rigid laws that ordered Aztec society were but a small earthly reflection of a much larger, more demanding and more terrifying order, the order of the cosmos. To truly understand the Aztecs, to understand their art, their wars, and their rituals, we must first understand their universe. They did not believe they lived in a stable or benevolent creation. Their world was not a gift, freely given by loving gods. They believed they inhabited a cosmos, born from divine violence, sustained by perpetual struggle, and trembling, always, on the very brink of annihilation. Theirs was a worldview steeped in a profound sense of cosmic anxiety and sacred duty. This sense of impermanence was rooted in their foundational myth, the legend of the five suns. According to Aztec cosmology, the world they inhabited was not the first world, but the fifth, in a series of creations, each with its own sun, its own form of life, and its own catastrophic end. The first sun, they believed, was the jaguar sun. It was a world inhabited by a race of giants who did not cultivate the land. This era was presided over by the god Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. After 676 years, this world came to a violent end when the giants were devoured by ferocious jaguars. The second sun was the wind sun, presided over by the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The world was populated by humans, but they were imperfect. This creation was destroyed by a great, magical hurricane that swept across the land. The people who survived were transformed into monkeys, their chattering cries an echo of their lost humanity. The third sun was the rain sun, under the dominion of the rain god Tlaloc. Again, the world was populated by people, but they were disrespectful and failed in their duties. Tlaloc, in his fury, sent down a rain not of water, but of fire, and burning volcanic gravel, destroying this third creation completely. The fourth sun was the water sun, governed by Tlaloc's consort, the water goddess Chalchiuhtlicue. The people of this age once again strayed from the correct path. This world was annihilated by a great deluge, a massive flood that submerged the entire earth. The people who survived were turned into fish. After the destruction of the fourth sun, there was only darkness and silence. This history, taught to every Aztec child, created a powerful and unsettling conviction that creation was not permanent. 3 times the gods had created humanity, and 3 times they had been destroyed for their failings. Their own world, the world of the fifth sun, was therefore not guaranteed. It was a precious, fragile, and temporary state, born from the ashes of past failures. And according to their prophecies, this fifth sun was also doomed. It was called the Sun of Movement, and it was destined to be destroyed, not by jaguars or floods, but by a series of great and terrible earthquakes that would shatter the world from within. This belief was not a fringe theory. It was the central defining fact of their existence, creating a constant, underlying sense of urgency to maintain cosmic balance and postpone the inevitable cataclysm. The story of the creation of their own sun was the key to their entire belief system. The myth tells that after the fourth sun was destroyed, the gods gathered in the primordial darkness at the ancient, sacred site of Teotihuacan. They huddled together and asked, "Who will take on the duty of being the new sun? Who will bring light to the world?" 2 gods volunteered. The first was Tekuchitztecatl, a powerful, wealthy, and proud god, adorned in fine jewels and quetzal feathers. The second was the humble Nanahuatzin, a small, sickly, and pockmarked god, dressed in simple paper. The gods built a great ceremonial pyre, a massive bonfire that burned for 4 days. When the time came for the sacrifice, they called upon the proud Tekuchitztecatl to cast himself into the flames. But as he approached the fire, the immense searing heat caused him to recoil in fear. He tried 4 times to leap into the blaze, and 4 times his courage failed him. Seeing his hesitation, the gods turned to the humble Nanahuatzin. Without a moment's pause, the small, sickly god closed his eyes and threw himself into the very heart of the fire. There was a great crackling sound, and he was consumed, reborn in the flames as the new sun. Seeing this act of courage, the proud Tekuchihuatecl was overcome with shame. He followed Nanahuatzin, casting himself into the now slightly less ferocious embers of the fire. He too was transformed, but because he had hesitated, because his sacrifice was secondary, he emerged as a lesser light, the moon. But the ordeal was not over. The new sun, Nanahuatzin, rose in the sky. But it was stationary. It did not move. It hung in the east, bathing the world in a scorching, unblinking light. The earth began to burn. The gods realized that the initial sacrifice was not enough. To give the sun the divine energy, the life force, needed to begin its journey across the sky. They too had to make an offering. And so, one by one, all the other gods offered themselves up for sacrifice. Their divine hearts were offered to the motionless sun, and their sacred life force, their teolia, gave the sun the strength to begin its daily journey from east to west, setting the rhythm of time, of night and day, into motion. This myth is the single most important key to understanding the Aztec mind. It establishes what is known as the Great Debt, or Next-la-Hualtin. The world the Aztecs inhabited, the very movement of the sun in the sky, was created and set in motion only through the profound self-sacrifice of the gods. Humanity, created later, therefore owed the gods an immense and perpetual debt. If the gods had given their own blood and hearts to create the world, then it was the sacred and solemn duty of humanity to repay that debt, to nourish the gods with the same precious substance they had first offered. This was the theological foundation of human sacrifice. It was not, in their minds, an act of arbitrary cruelty. It was a vital act of cosmic reciprocity. They believed they had to feed the sun with human life force, contained in the heart and the blood, or it would run out of energy, it would cease its daily journey, and the world would be plunged into the permanent darkness and chaos that preceded the Fifth Age. The Aztecs worshipped a vast and complex pantheon of these gods, many of whom were absorbed from the cultures they conquered. A central concept was duality. Many gods had multiple, often contradictory aspects, representing the creative and destructive forces that the Aztecs saw all around them. At the head of their own pantheon stood Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south. He was the patron deity of the Mexica people, the god who, according to their legends, had guided them on their long migration to the Valley of Mexico. As we have seen in the myth of his birth, he was the god of the sun and of war, the divine warrior who, every single day at dawn, vanquished his siblings, the moon, Coyolque, and the stars, to bring light and heat to the world. He was a young, fierce and demanding god. It was he who had the greatest need for constant nourishment to win this daily cosmic battle. The largest and most frequent sacrificial ceremonies in Tenochtitlan were dedicated to him, to providing him the strength he needed to keep the forces of darkness at bay. Huitzilopochtli's rival and counterpart was Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. He was a powerful and unpredictable god of the night sky, of destiny, of discord and of sorcery. He was a trickster, a tempter, who could see into the hearts of men with his obsidian mirror. He represented the chaotic, arbitrary forces of the universe, the constant threat that things could, at any moment, fall apart. While Huitzilopochtli represented the order of the Aztec state, Tezcatlipoca represented the ever-present possibility of its collapse. A third major deity was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. He was an ancient god, worshipped throughout Mesoamerica long before the Aztecs rose to power. He was the god of the wind, of knowledge, of civilization, and of the priesthood. In the Aztec creation story of the Fifth Age, it was Quetzalcoatl who journeyed to Mictlan, the underworld, to retrieve the bones of the people from the previous suns. He ground these bones into a powder, and then sprinkled them with his own divine blood, and from this mixture, the humans of the present age were born. This act of self-sacrifice to create humanity further reinforced the theme of divine debt. Quetzalcoatl was often seen as a more benevolent, life-giving deity, a patron of arts and learning, in contrast to the warlike Huitzilopochtli. And, of course, there was the ancient god Tlaloc, the lord of the rain, whose shrine shared the top of the Templo Mayor. He was a god of immense power and duality, a life-giver who brought the rains that made the Chinampas fertile, but also a terrifying destroyer who could unleash devastating floods, hailstorms, and crippling droughts. The cult of Tlaloc was focused on appeasement, on providing the offerings necessary to ensure he remained favorable. The ritual that has come to define the Aztecs in the popular imagination is human sacrifice. To approach this difficult subject with understanding, we must set aside modern sensibilities and see it through their theological lens. For the Aztecs, the act was not about murder or cruelty. It was a sacred and necessary magical transaction, the ultimate purpose of which was to release the divine life force, the teolia, which was believed to be concentrated in the heart and blood. This released energy was the food of the gods. The victims chosen for this solemn duty were, in the vast majority of cases, not Aztec citizens. They were warriors captured in battle from enemy states. The entire institution of Aztec warfare, particularly the so-called Flower Wars, was designed specifically to procure these healthy, high-status captives. From the shared Mesoamerican warrior's perspective, this was not a dishonorable fate. To be captured and offered to the gods in the enemy's capital was considered the most noble and glorious death a warrior could achieve. It was believed to guarantee them a privileged afterlife, where their souls would have the honor of accompanying the sun on its daily journey across the sky. The ritual process itself was laden with symbolism. A chosen captive warrior would often be treated with great honor for a period leading up to the ceremony. He might be given fine clothes, feasted, and allowed to walk through the city. For a time he was treated as an exipler, a divine impersonator, a living vessel for the god to whom he would be offered. He was no longer a simple man from an enemy city. He was, for a short time, the god himself, walking on the earth. The ceremony took place at the summit of the pyramid, a sacred, liminal space that existed between the human world and the divine realm. Here, before the shrine of the god, the priest, using a sacred knife of obsidian or flint, would perform the solemn act of opening the captive's chest to offer the still-living heart to the sun. The body, now a sanctified and empty vessel, was also treated with ritual reverence. It was this act, repeated hundreds or even thousands of times a year, that the Aztecs believed kept their world turning. The great skull rack, that Tzompantli, that stood beside the temple, was not seen as a gruesome trophy case, but as a sacred archive of these offerings, a visible testament to the piety of the state and its fulfillment of the great cosmic debt. While these large-scale ceremonies were the most dramatic expression of this belief, a far more common practice was personal auto-sacrifice. Every Aztec, from the emperor down to the most humble farmer, participated in the system of repayment by regularly offering small amounts of their own blood. Using a sharpened bone, an agave thorn or an obsidian lancet, they would pierce their earlobes, their tongues or their limbs, allowing a few drops of blood to fall onto paper or into a ceremonial vessel as an offering. This was a constant, personal and painful reminder of the debt owed to the gods, and their own small role in maintaining the balance of the universe. The Aztec belief system, in its entirety, was a coherent, all-encompassing, if terrifying, worldview. It provided an explanation for the creation of the universe, a justification for the structure of society, and a clear, if demanding, prescription for how to live. From their perspective, their rituals were not a matter of choice or cruelty. They were a matter of absolute necessity. To fail in these duties, to stop feeding the gods, would lead to the end of everything. The sun would fail, the crops would wither, and the earthquakes that were destined to destroy their world would surely come. The great sacrifices were the terrible, sacred price they believed they had to pay for one more day, one more sunrise, one more season of life in the fragile world of the fifth sun. The Flower Wars. The logic of ritual violence. The unceasing demand of the gods for nourishment, particularly the sun god Huitzilopochtli, in his daily battle against darkness, required a constant and reliable supply of the most precious of all offerings, the Teolia, the sacred life force of courageous warriors. While the great wars of conquest, which expanded the empire's borders, certainly provided a great number of captives from distant lands, the Aztec state also participated in a stranger, more formal, and more enigmatic form of conflict. This was not a war for territory, for tribute, or for political domination. It was a war for a different kind of harvest. This was the Xochiayotl, the Flower War. The name itself is a piece of grim poetry, a window into the Aztec martial worldview. The flowers in this context were not the blossoms of the field, but the still-beating hearts of valiant warriors, considered the most beautiful offering one could lay before the gods. The battlefield was the flowery field, the sacred garden, where these precious human blossoms were to be harvested. This framing elevates the act of ritual combat from mere violence to a form of sacred agriculture, a necessary tending to the needs of the cosmos. A flower war was a pre-arranged, highly ritualized battle, fought not to a conclusion of annihilation, but to a point of mutual satisfaction, where enough captives had been taken to satisfy the gods for a time. These conflicts were waged primarily between the Aztec Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, and their perennial, unconquered enemies, most notably the Confederacy of City-States in the neighboring Tlaxcala Valley. The traditional Aztec histories trace the origin of this unique institution to the mid-15th century during the reign of Moctezuma I. The story tells of a great famine that struck the Valley of Mexico, a period of several years marked by devastating droughts, cripplingly early frosts, and widespread starvation. The priests and rulers, deeply alarmed by this clear sign of divine displeasure, gathered to determine the cause. Their conclusion was that the gods were angry because they had not been provided with enough high-quality nourishment. The offerings had become insufficient. A new, more reliable method was needed to procure sacrificial victims of the highest possible value, brave enemy warriors. According to these histories, this crisis led to a formal agreement, a solemn pact made between the leaders of the Triple Alliance and their Tlaxcalan rivals. They agreed to engage in these ritual flower wars, at appointed times, and in specially designated locations. The explicit goal for both sides would not be to kill the enemy on the battlefield, but to capture them alive. This pact, if it truly existed in such a formal way, effectively created a stable and reliable marketplace for the sacred commodity of human hearts, ensuring that even in times of relative peace, the gods would not go hungry. While the religious motivation was undoubtedly paramount, the flower wars also served a profoundly practical military purpose. They functioned as the ultimate large-scale training exercise. In a world where military prowess was the cornerstone of the state, the flower wars kept the Aztec army in a state of constant readiness. It was a live-fire drill on a massive scale, allowing young warriors to experience the chaos and terror of real combat in a somewhat controlled environment. It was the primary arena for a warrior to prove his courage, to gain prestige, and most importantly, to advance in social rank. Aztec society was a meritocracy of violence, and the flower wars were its most important examination. The entire upbringing of an Aztec male was a preparation for this path. From a young age, boys were funneled into one of two educational systems. The sons of commoners attended the Telpochcali, the House of Youth, where they received practical instruction in a trade, but also underwent rigorous basic military training. They learned to handle weapons, to march in formation, and to endure hardship. The sons of the nobility attended the Calmacac, the elite priestly school. Here, alongside subjects like astronomy, theology, history, and statecraft, they received advanced instruction in military strategy and leadership. But regardless of their school, the ultimate measure of a man was the same. A young Aztec boy was not considered a true adult, was not granted the full rights of citizenship, until he had captured his first prisoner in battle. His first taste of manhood was inextricably linked to his success as a warrior. This system created a clear and visible hierarchy, a ladder of prestige that a warrior could climb one captive at a time. A young warrior who, with the help of his comrades, managed to secure his first captive, earned the right to cut his hair in a specific style that marked him as a man of potential. He was no longer a boy. Capturing a second, third, and fourth prisoner brought with it the right to wear more elaborate clothing and jewelry, and to bear more distinguished weapons. A warrior who had taken 4 captives had proven his skill and bravery beyond doubt, and was eligible to become an officer, or to join one of the 2 most prestigious warrior societies, the Jaguar Knights, or the Eagle Knights. These were the elite shock troops of the Aztec army, and their appearance was designed to inspire awe and terror. A Jaguar Knight wore a uniform made from the actual pelt of a jaguar, the powerful predator of the jungle, with the animal's head worn as a fearsome helmet. An Eagle Knight was covered from head to toe in the feathers of the eagle, the master of the sky. To wear this regalia was to embody the spirit of the animal itself. This visual hierarchy was a constant motivator. Every warrior could see, in the magnificent costumes of his superiors, the rewards that awaited his own success on the battlefield. This deep cultural emphasis on taking captives fundamentally shaped their entire approach to combat. To kill an enemy on the battlefield, while sometimes unavoidable, was seen as a clumsy and wasteful act. The precious offering was spoiled. True skill, true artistry in war, lay in the ability to wound, disable, and overwhelm a foe, to subdue them with minimal damage, so they could be taken alive, their hearts still blossoming for the gods. The flower war itself was as much a ceremony as it was a battle. The time and place for the conflict, the Xochitlalpan or Flowery Land, were arranged in advance by diplomatic heralds sent between the opposing powers. On the appointed day, the armies would march to the field. It was not a stealthy or hurried approach, but a grand and formal procession. The priests would be there in their ceremonial robes, swinging censers that filled the air with the thick, aromatic smoke of copal incense. The warriors would be arrayed in their finest regalia, a dazzling and intimidating display of color, polished obsidian, and shimmering feathers. The goal was to create a spectacle of power before the first blow was ever struck. The weapons they carried were perfectly suited to their tactical objective of capturing, rather than killing. The most iconic Aztec weapon was the macuahuitl. It is often called a sword, but it was more like a wooden paddle or club, about 3 to 4 feet long. Embedded along its two edges were razor-sharp blades of obsidian, a volcanic glass that can be flaked to an edge far sharper than any steel. This weapon was terrifyingly effective. A full-force blow could decapitate a man or a horse. However, its design also made it versatile. A skilled warrior could turn the weapon on its side and use the flat wooden paddle to deliver a stunning non-lethal blow to an opponent's head or body. Or, they could use the obsidian blades to slash at the leg muscles, disabling their foe without killing them. Other weapons included the atlatl, a spear thrower that acted as a lever to dramatically increase the range and velocity of a short spear or dart. Bows and arrows and slings that could hurl stones with deadly accuracy were also used, typically in the opening stages of the battle, to harass and disorganize the enemy ranks. Every warrior carried a shield, or chimali, often a round buckler made of wood or cane and covered in hide, but the shields of high-ranking warriors were works of art, decorated with elaborate and beautiful mosaics made from thousands of tiny, brightly colored feathers. The battle would commence, not with a silent charge, but with a cacophony of sound designed for psychological effect. The air would split with the shrill blasts of conch shell trumpets, the deep, resonant booming of drums, and the unified war cries of thousands of men. This wave of sound was the first assault. As the armies closed, the conflict would often break down from a cohesive battle line into a series of frantic, individual duels. A jaguar knight would seek out an opponent of equal stature, another elite warrior from the enemy side. It was a matter of honor to engage a worthy foe. The act of capture was a coordinated effort. A lead warrior would engage and subdue an enemy, perhaps with a stunning blow from his macuahuitl, or by wrestling him to the ground. Once the opponent was disabled, the warrior's assistants, often younger trainees who had not yet secured a captive of their own, would rush forward. It was their job to quickly bind the defeated enemy with ropes of agave fiber. The senior warrior would get the formal credit for the capture, adding another notch to his record and moving him up the social ladder. The young assistants, in turn, gained invaluable battlefield experience and participated directly in this most sacred of duties. The battle would continue in this fashion, a series of intense, personal struggles across the field. It might end when one side lost its nerve and broke, but often it would conclude by mutual, unspoken agreement. When enough captives had been taken by both sides, or as the sun began to set, the fighting would simply cease. The objective had been achieved. The gods had been provided for. The armies would then withdraw, each taking their bound, living flowers, back to their respective cities, for the inevitable ceremonies to come. The institution of the Flower War was a brilliant, if grim, solution to a number of challenges faced by the Aztec state. It was, first and foremost, a religious imperative, fulfilling the state's sacred duty to the gods. It was also a highly effective state-sponsored military training program, ensuring the Aztec army remained sharp and experienced. It was a vital mechanism for social mobility, providing a clear path for ambitious young men to achieve honor and status. And finally, it was a tool of low-intensity geopolitics. It kept powerful, independent states like Tlaxcala perpetually engaged and bleeding, contained within their borders, without the immense cost and risk of a full-scale war of total conquest. This unique form of ritualized warfare, however, so perfectly adapted to the political and religious realities of the Mesoamerican world, contained a fatal flaw. The Aztec military machine became a master of a specific kind of combat, the stylized one-on-one duel aimed at capturing an individual. Their training, their weapons, their entire military philosophy revolved around this goal. It left them tragically unprepared for an enemy who fought by a completely different and far more lethal set of rules. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived, the Aztecs encountered an enemy who sought not to capture, but to kill. An enemy who used cavalry to shatter formations, who fought with steel swords designed for lethal thrusting, and whose primary goal was the annihilation of the opposing army on the field of battle. The flowery fields had taught the Aztecs how to be the perfect warriors for their own world, but it had not prepared them for a war of total conquest against a foe from another. The aftermath. A world transformed. The intricate, ritualized military doctrine of the Flower War, so perfectly suited to the religious and political needs of the Mesoamerican world, proved tragically inadequate against an enemy who did not share its rules and did not comprehend its purpose. The final siege of Tenochtitlan, which began in the spring of 1521, was not a flower war. It was a war of annihilation. It was the collision of two incompatible worlds, and one of them was destined for ruin. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, having been driven from the city the previous year, returned with a massive army, bolstered by tens of thousands of indigenous allies, most notably the Tlaxcalans, who saw this as their chance to finally break the power of their ancient enemy. Cortés, a shrewd and ruthless strategist, understood that to defeat Tenochtitlan, he had to first defeat its environment. His campaign was not just a series of battles, but a systematic dismantling of the city's engineered life support system. He ordered the construction of a fleet of 13 small, shallow-draft warships, called brigantines, which he had built on the shores of the lake, and then launched onto its waters. These vessels, armed with small cannons, gave him command of the lake. They could outrun and overpower the Aztec war canoes. With this naval superiority, he was able to blockade the city, cutting off the flow of food that came from the mainland and from the more distant Chinampas. His forces captured the Great Causeways, isolating the island capital from all support, and in one of his most devastating moves, he sent a force to destroy the Chapultepec aqueduct, severing the city's only source of fresh drinking water. What followed was a siege that lasted for 93 days. It was a slow, agonizing process of attrition. The fighting was fierce, with the Aztec warriors, under the command of their final and defiant Tlatoani, Cuauhtémoc, resisting with incredible courage. But they were fighting a war on multiple fronts. They fought the Spanish and their allies in the streets. They fought the gnawing hunger, as their food supplies dwindled to nothing. They fought the terrible thirst as they were reduced to drinking the brackish, salty water of the lake. And, most devastatingly, they fought an enemy they could not see and could not comprehend. An invisible plague had swept into the city, an ally of the Spanish that was far more deadly than any cannon or steel sword. It was smallpox. Carried to the Americas by a single infected person in the Spanish entourage, the virus found in the dense population of the Valley of Mexico, a virgin soil. A people with no prior exposure, and therefore no immunological defense. The disease tore through the besieged city. It produced high fevers, agonizing pain, and a terrible rash of pustules. The mortality rate was catastrophic. It killed warriors, women, and children alike. It claimed the life of the Emperor Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's successor, leaving the city leaderless at a critical moment. The plague respected no battle lines, sapped the strength of the defenders, and filled the city with a sense of hopelessness and divine abandonment. On August 13, 1521, after months of relentless pressure, starvation, and plague, the last defenses of Tenochtitlan fell. The city, once the shimmering jewel of the Americas, was a ruin. Its canals choked, its temples smoldering. Cuauhtémoc was captured, and with his surrender, the Aztec Empire as a political entity ceased to exist. The military conquest, however, was only the beginning of a much longer and more profound transformation. The most immediate and catastrophic consequence was demographic. The smallpox pandemic of the siege was but the first wave of what historians now call the Great Dying. The biological isolation of the Americas for thousands of years had created a unique human population, but one that was vulnerable to a host of old-world pathogens. In the decades that followed the conquest, wave after wave of new diseases washed over the indigenous population. There was measles, then influenza, then typhus, each one finding a populace with no acquired immunity and reaping a terrible harvest. The numbers are difficult to comprehend, but they represent what is likely the single greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. The best estimates suggest that the population of central Mexico in 1519 was somewhere between 15 and 25 million people. By the end of the 16th century, less than 100 years later, that population had plummeted by as much as 90%. In many areas, entire communities simply vanished. their social structures collapsing under the weight of mass death. It was a silent, biological conquest that dwarfed the military one, a tragedy of such immense scale that it fundamentally and permanently altered the human landscape of the continent. Alongside this demographic collapse came a spiritual one. The Spanish friars who followed the conquistadors, primarily from the Franciscan and Dominican orders, saw their mission as a spiritual conquest. They believed the Aztec religion was a form of devil worship, and they embarked on a systematic campaign to eradicate it. They smashed idols, burned the sacred painted codices, destroying an irreplaceable library of history and theology, and they tore down the great temples. The most potent symbol of this spiritual conquest was the construction of the Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City, directly adjacent to the ruins of the Templo Mayor, using many of its stones for the foundation. The center of the old cosmos was deliberately buried and replaced by the center of the new faith. But the old beliefs did not simply disappear. The roots of a worldview that had been cultivated for thousands of years ran too deep. Instead of vanishing, the old religion went underground, where it began to merge and blend with the new faith of Catholicism in a complex process known as syncretism. The people of Mexico, faced with a faith imposed by force, found ingenious ways to preserve their ancient traditions within the framework of the new one. The most famous and powerful example of this is the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe. In 1531, just a decade after the conquest, a Nahua man named Juan Diego reported seeing an apparition of a dark-skinned Virgin Mary on the hill of Tepeyac, just north of the city. This was no coincidence. Tepeyac had been the sacred site of a major shrine to the Aztec mother goddess, Tonantzin, whose name means, "Our Sacred Mother." The Virgin who appeared spoke to Juan Diego in his native Nahuatl language and became a uniquely Mexican symbol of the divine feminine. For the indigenous people, praying to the Virgin of Guadalupe became a way to continue their ancient reverence for Tonantzin in a form that was acceptable to the new Catholic authorities. This pattern was repeated across Mexico. The vibrant, multi-day celebrations honoring the dead, with their use of marigold flowers and offerings of food and drink for the souls of ancestors, merged with the Catholic holidays of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. The result was the unique and deeply syncretic holiday of Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, a tradition that retains its powerful pre-Hispanic roots to this day. Throughout the country, local village gods were quietly replaced by Catholic patron saints who often shared similar attributes. A god of lightning might become St. Barbara. A god of the hunt might become St. Sebastian. The sacred geography of the land was remapped with Christian names, but the old reverence for the sacredness of a particular mountain, spring, or cave often remained. This spiritual conquest was not a simple replacement, but a complex and enduring fusion. The conquest also triggered a profound ecological transformation. The Spanish, coming from the arid landscapes of their homeland, did not understand nor did they value the delicate hydraulic balance of the Valley of Mexico. They saw the lake not as the source of the city's strength, but as a nuisance, a constant flood threat, beginning in the colonial period and continuing for centuries. Massive engineering projects were undertaken to drain Lake Texcoco and the surrounding lakes. The result was an ecological disaster. The Chinampas, the source of the valley's incredible agricultural productivity, dried up and blew away as dust. The draining of the aquifer caused the entire region to become more arid, and it created the foundation for the chronic water shortages and land subsidence that plague modern Mexico City, which is built upon the soft, unstable clay of the old lakebed. The conquerors also brought their own plants and animals, which irrevocably altered the landscape. European livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats were introduced. Their grazing habits caused widespread soil erosion, while their unchecked populations destroyed native flora. Wheat was planted, often displacing the traditional maize. Sugarcane plantations were established. The entire diet and agricultural economy of the region began to shift. The arrival of the horse, of course, revolutionized transportation and warfare. This was not just a military or spiritual conquest, it was an ecological one. The old economic and social orders were also dismantled and replaced. The Aztec system of tribute, while demanding, was part of a reciprocal, if unequal, relationship. The Spanish replaced it with the encomienda system. In this system, the Spanish crown granted individual conquistadors the right to demand tribute and, more importantly, forced labor from specific indigenous communities. While technically these people were not slaves, the encomienda system was often even more brutal and exploitative than what had come before. creating a new landed aristocracy and forcing the indigenous population into a state of serfdom. And so, the old world passed away. A new world, the world of colonial Mexico, was born from this violent and complex collision. The world of the Aztecs, with its floating gardens, its cosmic anxieties, and its tribute-fueled splendor, is gone. It lies buried, physically and metaphorically, beneath the sprawling streets of a modern metropolis. The sounds of its great snakeskin drums are silent. The smoke from its temple fires has long since cleared from the high mountain air. Yet, the legacy of this powerful civilization endures. The Nahuatl language is still spoken by more than 1 million people. The foods they cultivated, maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, chilies, and chocolate, were adopted by the entire planet, transforming global cuisine forever. The central emblem on the modern flag of Mexico is the fulfillment of the Aztec origin myth. An eagle, perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent, the very vision that told the wandering Mexica they had found their home. Our long journey tonight, from the daily toil of the Chinampa farmer to the cosmic terror of the fifth sun, has been an exploration of a world that was as brilliant as it was brutal, as sophisticated as it was severe. It is a story that reminds us of the profound complexity of the past, and of the unique and powerful ways that different cultures have sought to make sense of their universe. It is a powerful reminder of the fragility of any civilization, of how a magnificent and intricate world, built over centuries of labor and belief, can be irrevocably shattered by forces it cannot comprehend. It is a story of a world lost to time, a story whose final, quiet echoes now give way to silence. Our journey is now at an end. The story of Tenochtitlan is complete. The past remains in the past, and you are here, now, safe in the present moment. There is nothing more to do, nothing more to learn. All that is left is to let go of the thread of the story, to let your mind be still, and to allow the gentle tide of sleep to carry you away. Let the day dissolve and drift into a deep and peaceful rest. Sleep well.